We're reading every Spider-Man ever, and this is a compilation of some of the past recaps that I release every Thursday. Steve Ditko was the co-creator of Spider-Man, and despite only being on the title for 4 years, he was responsible for so many elements that made Spider-Man iconic. Let's take a look now at every issue that Steve Ditko wrote and drew and inked. Amazing Fantasy 15. Peter Parker is a nerdy orphan who loves his Aunt May and Uncle Ben and science, so he goes to watch a science experiment, and so does a spider. The spider gets zapped, Peter gets bitten, and he suddenly has spider powers. He can climb walls, he can crush pipes, and he can walk down wires. With a costume and some web shooters and the ability to shoot a candle, he becomes famous. So famous that he doesn't have to listen to a guard who wants him to stop some thief running past him, so he lets the thief go. Then, one night after a sold-out show, he comes to find police outside his house. His Uncle Ben interrupted a home burglary and was shot. Angry, Peter chases after the murderer. He scares him, webs him, and punches him unconscious, but in the light of day, he notices his worst nightmare. The murderer was the same thief that he let escape. Our story ends with Peter Parker walking down an alley, pondering on the fact that, with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Amazing Spider-Man number 1, part 1. Peter Parker is still very angry that his Uncle Ben is dead and it's all his fault, and landlords are asking Aunt May for money because landlords are the worst. But it's okay because he's a star and he can make all sorts of money until J. Jonah Jameson comes along. JJJ rallies against Spider-Man, going on tour to tell people that he's a menace.
I say the Spider-Man should be outlawed!
Instead, he wants people to worship real heroes, like his son, John Jameson, who's about to blast off into space. But as his son takes off, the control system goes awry, and there's only one man who can help, Spider-Man. He commandeers a plane, flies up, webs to the out-of-control spacecraft, and refixes the control panel. As the parachute opens, John Jameson is saved, and everybody must love Spider-Man now, except for J. Jonah Jameson, who thinks it's a hoax, and the general public, and the FBI who have a warrant for his arrest, and his own Aunt May. Nobody loves Spider-Man anymore. Amazing Spider-Man 1, Part 2. Peter Parker is poor, but he has an idea. He'll join the Fantastic Four. Swinging across to the Baxter Building, he fights them to prove his worth, only to find out that they don't pay money, so he swings away angry. Meanwhile, across town, a master of disguise steals some documents. According to his own thought bubble, he is the chameleon, and hearing about the warrant for Spider-Man's arrest, he has the perfect idea. He'll frame Spider-Man. And it works for a short amount of time, but Spider-Man quickly figures out what's going on and chases the chameleon back to his Russian submarine. Spidey captures him and brings him back to the guards for arrest, but then a smoke bomb goes off and Chameleon has an opportunity to disguise himself as one of the guards. Even though Spidey can use his spider sense to detect him, it just looks like he's beating up a random guard, so he flees, never seeing that a torn piece of clothing gives the chameleon's game away. Amazing Spider-Man 2, Part 1. A master criminal called Vulture is swooping down from the sky to commit crimes, and J. Jonah Jameson wants pictures. And who better to take those pictures than Peter Parker? So he grabs a camera and he goes off to fight the Vulture, and ends up getting dunked in a water tower. As he recovers and makes some changes to his gear, Vulture warns everybody that he's going to steal a diamond shipment from under their noses. Everyone's eyes are to the skies, expecting an attack from above. But then, out of the sewer, Vulture pops out, grabs the suitcase, and makes his getaway. And he would have got away with it too if it wasn't for that pesky Spider-Man who fights him in the skies above Manhattan and then uses an anti-magnetic device to deactivate Vulture's wings. While he swings to safety, Vulture hits the ground and is arrested by the police. The issue ends with Peter Parker getting paid for the pictures he took, paying off a year's worth of rent for Aunt May, and Vulture languishing in jail and vowing revenge. Amazing Spider-Man 2, Part 2. Peter Parker is so good at science that he gets hired by an electronics expert, Professor Cobwell. Before his first day on the job, he visits the Tinkerer who's repairing a radio for the Professor and senses something odd. His suspicions are confirmed when he opens up the radio to find strange devices inside. He decides to visit the Tinkerer at night. Inside, he finds Martians working with the Tinkerer, using his repair jobs to spy on the world. He fights them but is quickly overwhelmed and trapped inside a glass case. However, using his webbing through a very small hole, he manages to free himself. The subsequent fight leads to a fire and the Martians escape, abandoning the Tinkerer. Spider-Man tries to rescue him, but with no luck, but he manages to escape. The Martians take off in their spaceship, destroying all the devices that they'd already created. Spider-Man would think that it was just a strange dream, if not for the mask that he pulled off the Tinkerer's face in his rescue attempt. Amazing Spider-Man number 3. Life is too easy for Spider-Man. Everybody's too easy to defeat and he wishes for someone harder. Granting his wish, the universe gives him Dr. Otto Octavius, also known as Dr. Octopus, an atomic scientist. An experiment goes awry and the Doctor finds himself with 4 metal arms attached to himself permanently. Across town, J. Jonah Jameson hears about the injured scientist and wants pictures, so he sends Peter Parker. Swinging to the hospital as Spider-Man, Peter discovers that Dr. Octopus has gone crazy and taken hostages. Spider-Man breaks in, fights Doc Ock and loses, getting thrown out of the window for his troubles. Despite wishing for stronger enemies, Peter Parker gives up. How can he be Spider-Man if he can't defeat this new bad guy? As Spidey retires, Doc Ock takes over an atomic facility. The army locks it down. No one's allowed in or out. Their only hope? The Human Torch. Only problem is, the Human Torch is fresh out of fire powers, so as he recharges he goes to a local school and teaches terrible maths. There he makes a speech to the students, telling them to never give up, and inspires Peter Parker to pick up the Spider-Man mantle once again. As the Amazing Spider-Man, he slingshots his way into the closed-off atomic facility, dodges the attacks that Dr. Octopus sends his way, and finds himself in a chemical lab. In the lab, Spider-Man creates a special chemical weapon so that when he faces Dr. Octopus again, he's able to fuse his metal arms together. They fight once more, but Spider-Man is ready this time and is able to deliver a knockout blow. Meanwhile, Johnny Storm is ready to fight Dr. Octopus, only to find that Spider-Man has already defeated him. Much to his confusion, Spider-Man thanks him for the inspiration and swings off. Our issue ends with none other than Flash Thompson, Peter Parker's school bully, telling him that Spider-Man is what a real hero looks like, never knowing the irony of his statement. Amazing Spider-Man number 4. Everyone thinks Spider-Man is a menace thanks to J. Jonah Jameson. Even criminals threaten to sue, so he pays JJJ a visit and leaves a surprise. On the way home, he sees a man being chased by the police, but when Spidey tries to catch him, the man turns into sand and escapes. Before the fight gets underway, Spidey's mask gets torn and he flees to keep his identity a secret. At home, as he sews up his costume, Peter watches a news program about the man he fought. He's called Flint Marko, and he escaped from prison and hid on a beach where they were doing nuclear tests, and now he can turn his molecules into sand. That's why they call him the Sandman. The next day, J. Jonah Jameson finds himself stuck to a chair thanks to Spidey's web surprise. After changing his trousers, he demands pictures of Spider-Man so he can accuse him of being the same person as Sandman. To get those pictures, Peter Parker has to turn down a date with Liz Allen at school, making terrible excuses and making her mad. As Peter curses his dual identity and his rotten luck, Sandman escapes from the police and breaks into Peter's school. Sandman threatens a professor to give him a diploma before Spider-Man interrupts and they fight in the hallways. Spider-Man is thwarted again and again and again by the fact that Sandman can turn to sand, but in the end Spider-Man lures Sandman down into a basement, tricks him into turning into his sand form, and then uses an industrial hoover to hoover him up. But he forgot to take the photos, so he throws some sand up in the air and takes pictures of himself leaping and punching. It's recreation, not lying, and with the Sandman defeated, Peter can go on his date with Liz Allen, which is exactly what he would do if she wasn't still angry with him and choosing Flash Thompson instead. For a brief moment, Peter gives in to Flash's taunts and gets angry before remembering his powers and what damage he could do to Flash. Instead, he goes home defeated, still a menace to everybody thanks to J. Jonah Jameson, and a coward to everyone at his school. Strange Tales Annual number 2. Johnny Storm of the Fantastic Four is practicing his flying and lockpicking skills. When he finishes up, he settles down to relax, only to find himself getting angry at all the headlines that are about Spider-Man, that egomaniac. Meanwhile, across town, career thief the Fox steals a Da Vinci painting and leaves some webbing behind to frame the oh-so-famous Spider-Man. Of course, Spidey knows that he didn't do it, but he needs some help finding the person who did, so he swings to Johnny's house for help. But Johnny hates Spider-Man and thinks that he's a criminal, and so the two of them fight in swimming pools and using fire duplicates. Eventually, Spider-Man traps the Human Torch in concrete, which gives him enough time to work on a new web formula designed to tackle the torch's heat. Spidey lures the torch out to a web made of ice webbing that douses Johnny's flame and allows Spider-Man time to explain. He's innocent. After the torch confirms Spidey's innocence, they team up to catch a thief. They travel around the city, uncovering secret hideouts belonging to the Fox, but each time he gives them the slip, sometimes dressed as an old woman. Eventually, some goons tip them off to head to Central Park, where they find the Fox disguised as a stargazer during the day. He tries to escape on rocket boots, but Spidey easily catches up, and the torch finds the missing Da Vinci inside the fake telescope. These two heroes still hate each other, but they save the day together. Amazing Spider-Man number 5. J. Jonah Jameson is on the news hating Spider-Man, and Flash Thompson is watching it and loves Spider-Man. So he doesn't give away his secret identity, Peter Parker pretends to be on the hate side and is dismissed by Flash and his fellow students. Also watching the news from another side of New York is Dr. Doom. He's tired of losing to the Fantastic Four, so he'll team up with the villain Spider-Man to help him defeat them. Of course, Spidey says no, and when he goes to web up the villain, he finds that he's been talking to a life model decoy all along. A fight leads to Spider-Man leaping into the river to get to safety, and by the time he makes it back to the building, it has exploded. Dr. Doom vows that Spider-Man will help him against the Fantastic Four anyway, and the first thing he'll do is discover his secret identity. Elsewhere, someone else is dressed as Spider-Man, Flash Thompson, looking to scare the Spidey-hating Peter Parker. And you guessed it, that's the Spider-Man that Dr. Doom kidnaps. With a Spider-Man in his grasp, Dr. Doom takes over all of the news channels and makes an announcement to the Fantastic Four: disband in an hour or he'll kill Spider-Man. Even though Peter Parker briefly considers leaving Flash to die, he eventually comes to the rescue, although not without cutting power to his own house to convince Aunt May that he has to leave. He sneaks into Dr. Doom's lair through a ventilation shaft, then avoids ice traps and fire traps and spinning balls of death. Spidey has the advantage in the fight until suddenly he's facing two Dr. Dooms, the actual Dr. Doom and the life model decoy from before. Exhausted, Spider-Man trips on one of the balls of death and Dr. Doom is ready to kill him. And that's exactly what he would do if not for the arrival of the Fantastic Four, so instead Dr. Doom flees. And so does Peter when he remembers he's left his aunt in the literal dark. Flash Thompson has a braggadocious tale to tell. But it's not all bad for Peter. Betty Brant, J. Jonah Jameson's secretary, might just have a crush on him. And he might have a crush on her. Amazing Spider-Man number 6. In Florida, a half-man, half-lizard is running rampage. The Daily Bugle challenges Spider-Man to defeat the creature, who they call the Lizard. But J. Jonah Jameson refuses to send Peter Parker. It wasn't a real challenge, he just wanted to sell papers. So instead, Peter visits a museum's dinosaur exhibition to learn more about lizards. While there, he thwarts a robbery turned kidnapping, saving Liz Allen and having her swoon over Spider-Man. But the Lizard is still at large, so it's time for Spider-Man to pay J. Jonah Jameson a visit. After some convincing from Spider-Man, Peter Parker is on his way to Florida to find the Lizard, and maybe visit a local reptile expert, Dr. Kurt Connors. In the swamps of Florida, the Lizard ambushes Spider-Man, nearly drowns him and throws him for almost half a mile. Instead of getting back into a fight he can't win, Spidey visits Dr. Connors' house instead, only to find his weeping wife. It turns out that Doc Connors is the Lizard. He was experimenting to use lizard DNA to regrow his missing arm and transformed himself into a monster. Knowing who the Lizard is, Spider-Man creates an antidote to his condition. He paddles out into the swamps of Florida and finds the Lizard talking to alligators, planning to take over the world. Spidey slips from the wall, revealing himself, and fights the Lizard and his alligator army. Eventually he traps the Lizard in a tower and is able to hold him still long enough to make him drink the antidote. Just before the Lizard can take care of Spider-Man for good, he turns back to Dr. Connors. After reuniting the Connors family, Spider-Man promises to keep Kurt's alter ego a secret, so he gets J. Jonah Jameson to tear up the photos by making him think that they're fake. Back in New York, Peter Parker calls up Liz Allen to ask her on a date, but she angrily hangs up on him. She's waiting on her one true love to call, Spider-Man. Our story ends with the promise of the very first returning Spider-Man villain. Amazing Spider-Man number 7. Thanks to Spider-Man inverting his magnetic wings, Vulture is in prison being the model citizen. But little do they know that he's inventing a new flying device until he escapes by flying over the prison walls. Peter Parker hears of the Vulture's escape and leaves to fight him, enduring mocking from Flash Thompson, who just thinks he's running away scared. But fighting Vulture should be easy, right? He's already defeated him once and he has the device to switch off his wings. And so that's the device he uses when he fights Vulture. And he wins! Vulture falls from the sky, but Spidey doesn't realise that it's a ruse and that these new wings aren't affected by his device, and Vulture flies up and sucker punches him. Spider-Man falls, and the web line that he fires to save himself misses, and he hits the rooftop hard, potentially breaking his arm. A crowd gathers to see his failure, and the Vulture crows. He's the man that defeated Spider-Man. No one can stop him now. With the city as his oyster, Vulture plans his next heist. He's going to steal from J. Jonah Jameson, the payroll from the Daily Bugle. Meanwhile, Peter Parker discovers that his arm is not broken, it's just sprained. But that doesn't stop Flash Thompson making fun of him. But at least he gets to flirt with Betty Brant, telling her the real reason why he hurt his arm, even though she doesn't believe him. Of course, if he's flirting with Betty Brant, then he's at the Daily Bugle, which means he's there when the Vulture attacks and can quickly turn into Spidey to stop him. They fight through the Bugle offices, Spidey almost gets crushed by a printing machine, and eventually Vulture escapes out of a window where he has the advantage. Spider-Man lets the Vulture ambush him and lets him fly them both up into the sky before he webs the Vulture's wings up and they both come plummeting to Earth. Luckily, Spider-Man can create a web parachute and lets the Vulture float down to his arrest. In a trashed Bugle office, a wounded Peter Parker finds Betty Brant again, says that he was hiding in a closet, and promises her romance in her future. Amazing Spider-Man number 8, Part 1. Flash Thompson is bullying Peter Parker when a robot is wheeled into the room. It's the living brain, the smartest robot in the world, capable of answering any question. So the class asks it who Spider-Man really is. They feed in a bunch of information about Spider-Man, and then Peter Parker is tasked with collecting and decoding the answer, but Flash tries to snatch it away. Things get physical between the two of them, so the teacher suggests a boxing match to settle their differences. Everyone is sure that the Flash is going to defeat Peter, but he's worried about using too much spider strength and killing Flash. Even with the tiniest of taps, Peter sends Flash flying, but Flash just thinks he must have tripped or something. No way that puny Parker is that strong. Meanwhile, two men are trying to steal the living brain to help them predict lottery numbers and become rich, but they accidentally activate it and it goes wild. The distraction causes Flash to look away at a vital point, and Peter knocks him out cold. He carries the unconscious Flash to a locker room and uses that as an excuse to change into Spidey. He fights the living brain, but it's constantly learning and is able to counter everything he throws at it. He tries catching it in a web or keeping his distance, but the robot tears through the web and throws a door at him. Eventually, the living brain moves threateningly towards some students, and Spidey is forced to take a risky action. He jumps on the robot and reaches for the control switches. He's able to switch the living brain off while caught in his grip, and swings them both to safety through a window to avoid falling down some stairs. With the living brain defeated, the two would-be robbers try to escape, only to trip on a freshly awakened Flash Thompson. The students are convinced that Flash stopped them, and Peter sows more confusion by pointing out that Flash was the only person that wasn't around when Spider-Man was here, and he seemed awfully keen on getting hold of that paper with Spider-Man's identity. That must be it. Flash must be Spider-Man. That's why he's so deliberately lost to Peter. Since he got to punch Flash in the face without giving his identity away, Peter Parker walks home happily, whistling a jaunty tune. Amazing Spider-Man number 8, Part 2. Spider-Man decides to visit the Human Torch's girlfriend to steal her away from him like a jerk, and finds a party instead. He crashes it with a web bat like a jerk, and when Johnny Storm gets rightfully angry, the two men fight. With fire arrows, fire discs, and a giant fire net, the Human Torch has Spidey on the ropes when the other members of the Fantastic Four offer to help. But instead of accepting that help, Spidey fights them too, like a jerk. He's only stopped by an invisible Sue Storm, who encourages Spidey and her brother Johnny to make up, but they refuse. Instead, Spidey insults the three men like a jerk and swings off, leaving a web heart for Sue like a creep. Amazing Spider-Man number 9. Across town, the world is about to meet Electro. The power of electricity is his, and he uses it to rob an armored car. The next morning, Aunt May is rushed to the hospital, and because of the American medical system being dumb, Peter is worried about paying for her operation. Electro's crime spree continues, and he robs a bank that J. Jonah Jameson is in. And because Electro can also climb walls, JJJ is convinced that he's Spider-Man and prints that as a headline. So now Peter has to worry about an $1,000 medical bill and being a villain. Luckily, there's a reward for Electro's capture, which will solve both of his problems. He finds Electro robbing a safe, webs him up and goes to grab him. Bad idea. He's electrocuted unconscious. With Electro gone, the only way to raise money is to lie and pretend that his photographs prove that Electro is really Spider-Man. Gloating about his defeat of Spider-Man, Electro recounts his backstory to himself, an electrician struck by lightning while mending wires, and then breaks into a prison to free the captives there. Peter hears about this prison break on a police radio, but he's visiting his aunt. As the prison riot takes place, he's waiting on the operation with Betty Brant by his side. When his aunt is safe and sleeping, he heads to the prison against Betty's wishes. How can she be with someone who likes danger so much? He swings to the prison, puts on some rubber gloves and boots, and then breaks up the prison riot with fists and kicks and leaps. And thanks to the rubber gloves, he can punch Electro. When Electro counters with electric whips, Spidey sprays him with a hose and short-circuits him. At the Daily Bugle, Peter sells actual photographs to Jonah for cheap to make up for the fake ones he sold earlier. As he leaves, Betty confronts him, angry that he faced danger and didn't listen to her. She's about to explain a deep secret about her past, but Peter leaves angry. Even though his aunt is well after the operation, he's brooding when he leaves the hospital. Luckily, Betty races up to him and apologizes, and they walk off into the evening, groping for the right words to say to each other. Amazing Spider-Man number 10. The Big Man is a new masked criminal in town, and he's making Spider-Man look like a fool. He wants to take over all the gangs in New York and attacks them with his enforcers. There's Fancy Dan, fast and a master of judo, Ox, big and powerful, and Montana, an expert with a lasso. Big Man has already outsmarted Spidey today, and he'll do the same for any gang leader who doesn't stay in line. Unaware of all this, Peter Parker is in hospital, donating his blood for a transfusion for Aunt May, and weakened because of it. Therefore, it's a terrible time for Big Man's gangs to be attacking New York. The police are trying to keep it under control, but can only arrest small-time crooks. With his city under siege, J. Jonah Jameson tasks his star reporter, Frederick Foswell, to write an article that proves that Spider-Man is the Big Man, apparently learning nothing after accusing him of being Electro last issue. And outside of his bugle, the enforcers are shaking down Betty Brant for money that she borrowed from a loan shark, even after she paid it back. Peter Parker jumps in to help, but can't reveal his Spider-Man-ness. Instead, he gets beat up and lets them get away. But he quickly follows as Spider-Man, tracks them down and beats them up. But he has to escape the fight when his endurance fails him due to his recent blood loss. As he flees, he also notices J. Jonah Jameson on the street below. Could he be the Big Man? At home, Peter tries calling Betty to apologize for being beaten up, but she refuses to talk to him and leaves town. The next day, Peter uses himself as bait. At school, he talks about knowing the Big Man's identity and is quickly kidnapped by the enforcers. In a cell, he changes into Spidey and escapes, finding himself in the middle of a meeting of mob bosses. He fights them all, avoiding lassos from Montana, tires from Ox, and the judo mastery of Fancy Dan, but he's outnumbered and cornered, so he uses his spider signal on his belt to grab the attention of the police. They break up the meeting and the Big Man gets away. Hoping to capture the person he thinks is the Big Man, Spidey swings to the Daily Bugle and finds Jonah with Foswell. A policeman comes into the office to arrest the Big Man, and Spider-Man is proved right up until it's Frederick Foswell that's arrested. Later, alone, Jonah monologues to himself about why he really hates Spider-Man. That Spider-Man reminds Jonah of everything that he isn't, just by existing and doing good. Meanwhile, his enemy Spider-Man is worried about the missing Betty, and the missing Betty sits in a chair alone and cries. She has to face something alone. I mean, Spider-Man can help, but how would she ever reach him? Amazing Spider-Man number 11. Peter Parker is mourning the missing Betty Brant when he learns that Doc Ock is being released from prison. In order to keep tabs on him, Peter creates a spider tracker that he can sense with his spider senses. But when he goes to track Doc Ock, he finds that it's Betty Brant picking him up from prison, so he tracks her car instead. Luckily, she also drops a map so he knows where to go. Philadelphia. Once there, he finds Betty as Peter Parker, and she's so happy that he looked for her that she shares everything. Her brother is in debt with a mob boss called Blackie, who wants Doc Ock to break him out of prison. So Betty was helping her brother achieve this. In a sharing mood, Peter decides that he's also going to tell Betty that he's Spider-Man as soon as they get home. Foreshadowing. Spider-Man is too late to stop Doc Ock freeing Blackie, and then too late to stop them from kidnapping Betty and her brother as hostages. He does manage to catch up with them on a boat out of the country though, and it interrupts Doc Ock's attempts to hold a coup. Spidey fights off the gangsters while Blackie reaches for a gun. The resulting tussle leads to a stray shot, hitting Betty's brother, and she blames Spider-Man for it. If only Peter was here. Angry, Spidey defeats Blackie, but is immediately put on the defensive by Doc Ock. Spider-Man is chased around the ship, narrowly avoiding the Doc's deadly arms, and when he finally gets away, Doc Ock takes Betty hostage and flees onto a smaller boat. Spider-Man follows, despite the smaller fighting space being a much more dangerous place for him, and the two battle until the boat crashes. It looks like Doc Ock got away. Back on shore, Peter consoles Betty as she mourns her brother and declares her anger at Spider-Man for causing his death. I guess Pete won't be revealing his secret to her anytime soon. Amazing Spider-Man number 12. With Flash Thompson and Liz Allen guessing at Spider-Man's identity and Peter starting to get sick, Betty Brant gets a phone call from Doc Ock. Since he knows she's working at the Bugle again, he kidnaps her to lure Spider-Man out. And since Jonah and Peter are there, he tells them to print a note to Spider-Man. Meet me at Coney Island. Spider-Man does this, but Peter's sickness is getting worse and he passes out in the middle of the fight. Doc Ock grabs him and unmasks Spider-Man, revealing Peter Parker to Jonah, Betty, and the world. But since he could barely put up a fight, Doc Ock doesn't believe that this is really Spidey and tosses him away. So instead of his identity being revealed, the worst Peter has to deal with is a chiding from Aunt May and some ribbing from Flash Thompson for playing the hero. But he's made a big fan of Liz Allen, who thinks his heroics were the most wonderful thing. Angry that Spider-Man didn't come, Doc Ock breaks the animals out of a zoo, but Spidey soon arrives on the scene, defeating lions, bears, and gorillas, because comics have to have gorillas. With the animals captured, it's Spider versus Octopus, and they fight across the city. They eventually end up in a sculptor studio, and their fight starts a fire. Doc Ock is trapped under a falling statue as the flames grow higher. Despite his best efforts, Spider-Man can't save the Doctor and uses his web shield to flee the building. Luckily, firefighters are able to deal with the fire and rescue the villainous Doc Ock, and he's dragged back to prison. As Peter once again, Parker finds himself turning down the amorous advances of Liz Allen, since he's already dating Betty, and Liz regrets ever being mean to the nerdy Peter. Amazing Spider-Man number 13. It looks like Spider-Man is a criminal again, since there's someone running around in a Spidey costume, doing all the things a spider can and robbing folks. This is great news for J. Jonah Jameson, who's reprinting all his old hate articles. It's less good news for Peter Parker, who knows it's not him, but is sure it can't be an imposter. Nobody can do the things he can. The only answer? Sleepwalking. And the only solution, never sleeping again. This leads to a grumpy Peter Parker who gets paranoid at a psychiatrist and snappy at Betty, who turns even grumpier when Jonah refuses to give an advance to help him pay bills. It's Spidey picks or nothing. And it's not like he can be Spider-Man because the public chase him down the moment he wears a suit. All that's left for Peter is to mope, even while Liz Allen flirts with him. Enter Mysterio, a new superhero in town who says that he can stop the villainous Spider-Man and teams up with J. Jonah Jameson to prove it. He uses the Daily Bugle to invite Spidey to Brooklyn Bridge, and Spidey accepts. On the bridge they fight, but everything Spidey throws at him is countered. Mysterio can also walk on walls, he can magically stop webs, and he has a smoke that switches off Spider-Man's spider sense. Spidey is forced to flee, and Mysterio celebrates his victory with a parade. The crowd cheers for the man that defeated Spider-Man, everyone except Flash Thompson. At the Bugle, Mysterio agrees to reveal his identity to Jonah, for a fee, and meets photographer Peter Parker, who slips a spider tracer into his cloak. That same Peter Parker then rushes away, upsetting Betty Brant on the way. It must be that new blonde he's been hanging around with. Using the tracer, Spider-Man follows Mysterio, who then reveals his backstory. He's a stuntman slash special effects artist who decides that, hey, he could be Spider-Man too. So he created some magnet boots to climb on walls and an acid spray to dissolve webs, and then robbed some banks to frame the real Spider-Man. And he would have got away with it too if it wasn't for a pesky tape recorder that Spidey was using to record the entire conversation. Spider-Man leaps out of the sense-numbing fog and fights Mysterio across a film set. Mysterio might be a stuntman, but he's not a superhero and he's quickly defeated. Back at the Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson is wrong Again, Spider-Man pays him a visit to give him a new perspective on life by hanging him upside down from the ceiling. But at least he has pictures of the earlier fight, and Peter's bills will get paid, and Spider-Man is exonerated. Amazing Spider-Man number 14. We start with our very first look at the Green Goblin, working on a flying broomstick. He's here to give the Enforcers orders. Remember them? Fancy Dan, Montana, and Ox? Well, they work for the Green Goblin now, and they want revenge on Spider-Man. Across town, a movie producer doesn't want revenge, they want another big hit after the nameless thing from the back lagoon in the murky swamp. And that's exactly what the Green Goblin promises him, a new hit movie with the Green Goblin, the Enforcers, and the actual real-life Spider-Man. Days later, Peter Parker hears about a green man on a broomstick and leaves a flirty Liz Allen to investigate. When he clashes with the Goblin, he's told about the movie offer, and soon Spider-Man himself is signing on to his first major motion picture. Also, lucky for him, the Daily Bugle want Peter Parker to take pictures of that very film. But unlucky for him, his smile makes Betty think that he's just excited to be around Hollywood dames and that blonde Liz that he keeps hanging around with. In New Mexico, where the film is being shot, the Green Goblin and the Enforcers offer to rehearse privately with Spider-Man, but they're throwing real punches, and Spider-Man realizes he's walked right into their trap. He's fought the Enforcers before and dispatches them easily, but the new foe, this Green Goblin, is harder to beat. The Green Goblin's bombs do enough to distract Spidey until the Enforcers can get the jump on him. Literally, they try to hold our hero, but he's too strong and throws them off. And before they can find him again, he uses his web and some tumbleweed to spin up a dust storm to hide. Meanwhile, back at home in New York City, we check in on the three women in Peter's life. His Aunt May is writing worried letters to her nephew. Liz Allen is arguing with Flash Thompson, who thinks she's only interested in Parker to make him jealous. And Betty Brant is trying very hard not to think about all those glamour girls from Hollywood. Back in New Mexico, Spidey hides in a cave and uses the shadows to web away the Enforcers. But when Goblin brings the fight to Spidey, one of his bombs awakens the Incredible Hulk, who's been hiding here. The Hulk instantly blames Spider-Man and attacks him, and the Green Goblin just takes a step back and lets the fight happen. But it's not a long fight, as Spidey quickly realizes that it'll be a fight that he will lose and escapes the cave to freedom. But he can't just leave, not when the Enforcers are still webbed up inside the Hulk's cave. So he sneaks back in and rescues his villains. By the time Spider-Man gets back to the movie producer, the Spider-Man picture has been cancelled. The producer wants to make a Hulk film instead, and Spider-Man is left without a paycheck. He gets just enough money to get back to New York. Arriving in New York before Parker, however, the Green Goblin returns to his secret lair, and convenient equipment blocks the reveal of his identity as he unmasks. He underestimated Spider-Man this time, and he didn't expect the Hulk, but he will bide his time to strike once more at the Amazing Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man number 15. Our story starts with Spider-Man busting a seemingly normal robbery, but the leader of the criminals is actually the Chameleon, who uses disguises to escape. And in his secret apartment, the Chameleon wants to dispose of Spider-Man once and for all, and he knows the perfect man to do it, Kraven the Hunter. A week later, Kraven is due to arrive in New York City from Africa and be greeted by the Daily Bugle press team as well as Flash and Liz. For the first time, Betty and Liz meet, and Betty is frosty. Kraven arrives by boat and is called Handsome and Rugged, and then is able to subdue some escaping snakes and a gorilla before Spidey can even get his costume on. When asked who he's here to hunt, Kraven answers that he's hunting the most dangerous man of all, Spider-Man. Jonah is mad at Peter for not taking pictures of Kraven, Betty is mad at Peter because Liz exists, and now Kraven wants to hunt him? Peter's not having a good day. Later, Kraven watches Spider-Man fight from a nearby rooftop, learning all he can about his quarry. But Spidey spots him and brings the fight to Kraven sooner than he'd have liked. The Hunter is on the back foot, surprised at how strong Spider-Man is, but manages to nick him with one of his special potion weapons. Spider-Man is poisoned and flees. The next morning, Peter has recovered from the poison, but can't stop his hands from shaking. He's able to hide it from his Aunt May, who has set him up on a date with some lovely niece of his neighbor. He's also able to hide it from the bitter Betty and a frugal Jonah at the Bugle, and he even runs into Kraven leaving the office. But he's a laughingstock of his chemistry class when his shaking hands lead to broken test tubes. Soon, Peter learns why Kraven was leaving the Bugle, as the headline reads, "Defeat of Spider-Man imminent. The only thing he can do is bring the fight to Kraven." But that is exactly what Kraven's expecting. It's a trap. At night, Spider-Man finds Kraven at the park, but it's a decoy Kraven, and the real Kraven springs a trap. While Spidey is able to avoid a net, he's momentarily distracted by a drum beat and has manacles strapped to his right arm and leg. The manacles are magnetic, and as Spider-Man tries to flee, his arm and leg are trying to pull themselves together. Using all his strength to avoid the magnetic pull, he deactivates a lamppost and plunges the park into darkness. Then, using his web fluid, he clogs the manacles, breaking the electromagnetics inside. Now it's Spider-Man's time to hunt. He finds one Kraven easily, but unmasks him to discover the chameleon in disguise, and then he stalks the real Kraven through the dark park with his spider signal to scare the hunter into being foolish, avoiding all the traps that Kraven has, and then trapping Kraven in a web. With Kraven defeated, he can take the key and free himself, but he can't free himself from a terrible love life, because Betty apologizes to him and asks him out that night, but he's got a date with a mystery girl. But then it turns out that mystery girl has a headache, so he tries to ring Betty, but she just blanks him. Then he tries to ring Liz, but she's out dating Flash Thompson. So he goes, dateless, dressed as Spider-Man, to watch Kraven and the Chameleon be deported. Amazing Spider-Man 16. Aunt May doesn't care about relationships. She wants Peter Parker to date the niece of her neighbor and won't take "I'm already in a relationship" as an answer. So Peter flees to his Spider-Man persona and swings around the city. As he does, he notices a blind man being hassled on the street and comes to the rescue. But as Spidey swings away, that blind man turns out to be Matt Murdock, also known as the superhero Daredevil. Daredevil swings back to his office where he finds his friends Foggy and Karen inviting him to the circus. But something sinister is afoot at that very circus. They have some kind of ominous plan and they're going to use Spider-Man to lure people there. After Peter finds a poster for the event, he decides that Spider-Man will go. It is for charity after all, but when Peter drops a circus ticket, which he absolutely doesn't need to have if he's showing up as Spider-Man, he upsets Betty, who thinks that he's dating another woman. The circus show begins with ominous words from the ringmaster, wearing a spiral hat. Spider-Man turns up to applause and does an incredible acrobatic performance. The audience loves him. The ringmaster wasn't really expecting him to show up, but that's not going to stop him. He steps out and hypnotizes everybody with his hat, including Spider-Man himself. With almost everyone in trance, the circus begins to rob everyone of their belongings. But I say almost everyone because Daredevil is blind, didn't see the spiral, and so remains untranced. Daredevil goes to stop the ringmaster, but with Spider-Man under his control, the ringmaster just sends Spider-Man to fight him. The two heroes are equally matched, but Spidey is slower because he keeps waiting for hypnotic orders, and Daredevil uses that to his advantage. Daredevil steals the ringmaster's hat back and uses it to bring Spidey out of his trance. Then Spider-Man takes on the entire circus, from trapeze artist to strongman, while Daredevil slips back into the guise of Matt Murdock and returns to his seat. Just as Spider-Man defeats the evil circus, the ringmaster has his hat once more and attempts to hypnotize Spider-Man again, but this time Spidey has his eyes closed underneath his mask. The hypnosis won't work on him, and after knocking the ringmaster out, he uses the same hypnotic hat to bring the audience back to waking. As the police cart the evil circus away, Spider-Man is sad he didn't get to know Daredevil better. Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1, and this is a long one. In prison, they have removed Doc Ock's arms, making him just an ordinary, jacked doctor again. But he can control his arms telepathically and uses them to break out of jail. Once free, he sets up a meeting with the other villains that Spider-Man has fought before: Kraven the Hunter, Electro, and Mysterio. They're just waiting for 2 more members to join them. After all, the Sinister Four just doesn't have the same ring to it. Elsewhere, Peter Parker catches his Aunt May in the attic, looking at pictures of his Uncle Ben. Filled with guilt, Peter swings away and remembers that fateful night that he let a burglar get away, and that same burglar killing his Uncle Ben. On a rooftop, he thinks about how much he hates being Spider-Man and how he wishes he was normal again. And then he is. He finds himself tripping off a roof, and even though he can catch himself from falling, all his powers are gone. He slinks home powerless and goes to bed, leaving Aunt May worried about him. At that very moment, the Vulture turns up at Doc Ock's meet. Alongside the Sandman, he makes up the 6th member. Doc Ock fills them in on the plan. Since none of the villains will work as a team, they will fight Spider-Man separately, weakening him on every encounter. They draw their order from a hat. The next day, Peter is still feeling sad about his loss of powers. He wanders off without eating breakfast, and his Aunt May thinks it must be something to do with that new girl he's seeing, Betty Brant. When she finds out that he didn't show up for school, Aunt May heads into the city to speak to Betty, and so they're both together when the Sandman and Electro turn up and kidnap them. They're taken to Doc Ock's hideout, and Aunt May immediately forgets about Uncle Ben and starts crushing on the man with the robot arms. Vulture informs J. Jonah Jameson that Betty has been kidnapped, and he informs Spider-Man. But Spider-Man doesn't have his powers. Still, that doesn't stop him from going to Location 1 to fight Villain 1, Electro. At an electrical factory, Electro tells Spider-Man that he has a card with the next step of the trail to find Betty, but Spider-Man will have to defeat him first. Electro then hurls a bolt of electricity which Spider-Man dodges? Wait, he dodged electricity. That means he has his powers back. He keeps on dodging thrown bolts until he finds some wire and uses that to ground himself. And because he's grounded, he's not affected when Electro zaps him, and he gets close enough to punch Electro unconscious in a glorious single-page spread. At the Daily Bugle, Jonah tells his staff not to bother him as he desperately calls the Fantastic Four to see if anyone has found Spider-Man yet. At the second location, Spider-Man is ambushed by 2 leopards and Kraven the Hunter, but he has his superpowers now and he's super quick and he has webbing, so he easily fends off the animals and then steals the card with the next location from Kraven's belt and swings away, barely a scratch. As he heads for location 3, he turns down help from the Human Torch, one of the many cameos in this annual that I've edited out for time, and Aunt May is enjoying tea and biscuits with her new octopus-themed suitor. At location 3, Spider-Man has to fight the X-Men. He manages to dodge Cyclops' beam and smash Beast, discovering that they were robots all along. Since he no longer has to worry about hurting the good guys, he makes light work of the remaining Robo X-Men and discovers Mysterio behind a metal wall. Even in a cloud of smoke, he easily punches and subdues the villain and then rescues the card from the fire. As Spider-Man swings to the 4th location, J. Jonah Jameson is still worried about Betty and still unsure that Spider-Man knows what's going on. When a spider turns up in his office, he just assumes that Spider-Man must have sent it and argues with it when it won't give him any message. The 4th fight with the Sandman seems like an easy one, but when Spider-Man leaps through Sandman's body to get the location card, he activates an escape-proof iron cell. This almost seems like the end of Spider-Man until Sandman realizes that he made the cell too perfect, too airtight, that there's now no oxygen to breathe. So Spider-Man escapes while Sandman slumps unconscious. At the Bugle, Jonah finds out that all the other papers in town have been reporting on Spider-Man's 4 fights. But since he told nobody to bother him, the Bugle was doing nothing. Everyone in town has scooped him. The 5th fight with the Vulture is high above the city and starts with an ultimatum. Vulture wants Spider-Man to take off his web shooters or he'll simply fly away, so Spider-Man agrees. As he finishes removing them, Vulture fires oil at Spider-Man, making him slip and then lassos Spidey's leg. But with his superhuman speed, Spider-Man turns Vulture's lasso against him, swings up on top of him and webs him to a building. At the Bugle again, Jonah discovers that the Bugle hasn't sold a single copy in the last hour. The last location for Spider-Man is an old castle. He breaks in to find an armless Doc Ock, who keeps him distracted until his octopus side ambushes Spider-Man from behind. But Otto gets too cocky, and a well-timed punch sends him reeling and the arms let go of Spider-Man. But this is only step 1 of Doc's plan, and he soon lures Spider-Man to a trapdoor that sends him into a glass tank. With the water stopping Spider-Man from leaping around, Doc Ock attacks with his arms, dragging his foe underwater. But Spider-Man discharges all of his webbing into the tank, tangling the octopus doctor up and securing victory. With the final villain defeated, Spider-Man soon finds where Betty and Aunt May are being held, and finds that his own aunt thinks Spider-Man is ghastly and villainous. So he swings away again and returns as good old Peter Parker to find that his aunt was more worried about missing her favourite TV show than any of the danger she was in. Elsewhere in prison, 6 men dressed in green, purple and yellow argue about whose fault it is that Spider-Man bested them once again. Amazing Spider-Man issue 17. The Green Goblin has some new gadgets and has been practicing on a dummy of Spider-Man. He's also not riding a broomstick anymore, he's riding a glider. I'm not sure it'll stick. At school, Flash Thompson is starting a Spider-Man fan club. Ironically, he won't let Peter Parker join. Parker is so boring, he'd probably faint if he ever saw the real Spider-Man. But minutes away, Spider-Man is swinging up to a helicopter to thwart some criminals, only to find out that it's a film set, and the criminals are actors. What an idiot! Jonah finds all of this hilarious, and Sam Raimi is inspired 4 decades later. As Peter walks with Betty and tries to forget his embarrassment, they bump into Liz and Flash. That Spider-Man fan club is holding a meeting at a club that Liz Allen's father owns, and Spider-Man will be there. As Liz invites Peter to join, much to Betty and Flash's annoyance, his spider sense goes off. There's something very suspicious about a man in the crowd. But by the time he can change into Spider-Man, the suspicious man has been apprehended by Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. Everyone loves Johnny, and everyone hates Spider-Man, and Peter just can't figure out why. Instead, he's just jealous. Before we get to the first official meeting of the Spider-Man fan club, 2 more things take place. Jonah schemes with Betty to put dampeners on the meet, worried that a fan club will make a hero of Spider-Man. And Aunt May still wants to set Peter up with this mystery girl, who we'll discover is also a big fan of Spidey, but she's sick with a bad cold. So then we get to the meetup. Everyone is there. Betty, Jonah, Flash, Liz. Also, Johnny Storm with a date, and the Green Goblin. After Spider-Man comes on stage to roaring approval, a frog is thrown at him and it explodes and snaps his web. While Spidey can land safely, the Green Goblin flies in and assaults him with goblin sparks, bats that release smoke, and pumpkin bombs. In the crowd, most people think it's an act. Betty is happy that Peter isn't here, since it means he can't like Liz all that much, and Liz is wondering why she never sees Peter and Spider-Man in the same room. Jonah hates how much of the crowd loves it, and Johnny Storm is the only person who sees it as real. So, as the Human Torch, he intervenes to help. While the Torch and the Goblin fight, Spider-Man decostumes and shows up as Peter. He makes quick small talk, flirts with Liz just enough to make Betty mad, and then dashes away. The Human Torch is losing to the Green Goblin when Spider-Man comes to the rescue. The Spider and the Goblin fight once more. The Goblin gets a good punch in, and then Spider-Man runs away. His fan club can't believe it. Jonah loves it. Spider-Man has turned chicken. Only Flash stands up for Spider-Man as the crowd leaves disappointed. With no Spider-Man to fight, the Green Goblin stuns the Torch and leaves, his battle a success. But why did Spider-Man leave? It's because he heard a phone call that Parker's aunt had had a heart attack and was in the hospital. Nothing was more important than getting to her bedside. He makes it there and spends some time with her in hospital, and then leaves, only to find everybody calling Spider-Man a coward. Why must Peter Parker always pay for being Spider-Man? Amazing Spider-Man issue 18. The last we saw of Spider-Man, he was running away from the Green Goblin, and the world reacts to this. Villains are sad that they weren't the person to win. Heroes are sad because they misjudged their fellow hero, and J. Jonah Jameson is smiling because he always said that Spider-Man was a coward. The actual Spider-Man, shy Peter Parker, is taking care of his Aunt May and worrying about affording medicine. To help raise some money, he wants to sell his rights to a card company, but no one's buying the cards of a cowardly superhero, and they turn him down. To help relieve his stress, he wants to break up a crime, but he can't risk his life with a sickly Aunt May at home, so he just calls the police instead. To help his loneliness, he calls Betty, but she's not talking to him after seeing him together with Liz in the last issue. Alone, poor, and sad, Peter thinks about how his villains just keep getting stronger, and he gets nothing out of being Spider-Man except pain. The only person who is having a good time in all of this is Jonah, who is crowing on the news. This just makes things worse for Peter. After visiting some scientists to try and sell them his webbing formula, which doesn't happen because it dissolves too quickly, Spidey bumps into the Sandman. Of course, if he's not going to stop some random robbers, he can't fight the Sandman, so he doesn't. He runs away and hides. The whole world sees this secondary act of cowardice, especially Jonah, who keeps playing it on repeat on the news. People are in shock. Johnny Storm in particular can't believe it. There must be something going on, so he leaves a message in the sky in fire to meet with Spider-Man, but Spider-Man doesn't show. The last person in the world still standing by Spider-Man is Flash Thompson, who angrily threatens anybody who has a harsh word to say about Spidey. To prove that Spidey is still a hero, Flash dresses as Spider-Man. He hopes that the real Spider-Man will come to rescue him if he gets in trouble, or that he'll stop a crime dressed as his favourite hero, but he doesn't. He just gets beaten up. Peter Parker without a costume is ready to save him when the police arrive. Instead, Flash is left angrier, not knowing why his hero didn't show. Peter Parker has lost his confidence. He's lost his fans and his allies. He's lost the respect of the people of New York. And when he sees her with another man, he discovers that he's lost Betty too. There's only one thing to do. He quits being Spider-Man. And that was the end of the character, and I guess the end of this series. So thank you all for your support and your likes here. There's no reason that he would change his mind, especially not in the last 2 pages of the issue. But I'll check anyway. So Aunt May is missing from her wheelchair when Peter comes downstairs, no longer the amazing Spider-Man. When he finds her, she lectures him about worrying too much. Parkers are tough folk. They have a will to live and to fight. So when Peter looks at the Bugle and sees a headline about him being a coward, he realizes that that same will to live and fight is inside him. So he recovers the costume from the trash and he's Spider-Man once more. And I guess this series continues. But seriously, thank you for the support. Amazing Spider-Man issue 19. After giving up the mantle for all of 5 minutes, Spider-Man is back, stopping criminals with flips and kicks and making J. Jonah Jameson sad. Later and elsewhere, the Human Torch is flying home from an encounter in one of those non-Spider-Man comics when he is ambushed by the Sandman and the Enforcers. They use a chemical foam and Sandman's body to douse Johnny Storm's flame, then they lock him away in a glass container without oxygen to flame on. As Johnny languishes in that glass prison, things look up for Peter Parker. His aunt is well and making breakfast, and his classmates love Spider-Man again. As he leaves school, he spots Fancy Dan from the Enforcers. He follows him to a criminal hideout where he enjoys being able to easily win against those very criminals, dodging through lassos and singing songs. It's only the arrival of the police that puts a stop to the fight and lets the Enforcers slip away. Later, at the Bugle, Betty introduces Peter to the man she's been dating, Ned Leeds. But because everything is working out for him, Peter doesn't really mind. Not even an angry J. Jonah Jameson can affect him. Instead, he just shows up as Spider-Man to mock his boss. In search of the Enforcers, Spider-Man leans on an informant, but answers come way too quick and too readily, and Spidey suspects a trap. So he uses stealth to rescue Johnny. He hides in the shadows and crawls across ceilings, avoiding everybody on watch. He even has time to set up a camera, but he doesn't notice the sand resting on top of Johnny Storm's cell, and that quickly becomes the Sandman. Now fighting Sandman and the Enforcers, things are looking rough for the webhead. So, to even the odds, he flings himself at the glass of Johnny's cage and grants the Human Torch enough oxygen to live up to the Torch part of his name. Together, the Human Torch and Spider-Man make quick work of the villains, working wonderfully together as a team. That is, until they wind up tangled up in a web together as the Sandman escapes. Luckily for our heroes, Sandy only escapes into the arms of police officers and surrenders so he doesn't have to fight our two heroes again. At the Bugle once more, Peter is able to cheer up Jonah a little with exclusive pictures of the previous fight. Everything is working out for him. Except he doesn't notice a man in a purple suit. A man that knows about Peter Parker and follows him home. A man who calls a mysterious person plotting some kind of plan. They just need to know something for certain and then they'll act. Amazing Spider-Man issue 20. The last we left Peter Parker, he was being followed by a mysterious man, and that's still the case, but thanks to his spider sense, Peter now knows. As Spider-Man, he follows the man and sees him call his mysterious boss, but he can't hear what is said, so he scurries home, almost revealing his identity to Aunt May. Elsewhere, at the Bugle, J. Jonah Jameson wishes for an anti-Spider-Man serum, but he finds the next best thing, genetic experimentation. Outside, Peter enters the building, and his stalker takes the opportunity to report to his boss. But, surprise, they have the same boss, J. Jonah Jameson. We learn that the man is Mac Gargan, and Jonah wanted him to follow Peter to learn how he takes photographs of Spider-Man. But he has a better idea now, and is willing to pay Mac to help. Jonah takes Gargan to a genetic scientist, Dr. Farley Stillwell. He pays Stillwell $10,000 to grant Mac Gargan the power to defeat Spider-Man. Stillwell reluctantly agrees. He needs the money after all, and he uses a custom formula and electricity to grant Gargan scorpion powers. With a custom tail that can hit like a sledgehammer, Mac becomes the Scorpion, strong enough to defeat Spidey. As this new villain is being formed, Peter is with Betty, waving Ned Leeds off as he goes on an assignment to Europe. He's secretly happy to have Betty all to himself again. He's less happy when Scorpion ambushes him outside of the Bugle offices. Scorpion is strong, hitting like a powerhouse with both fists and tail, but he forgot about Spidey's webs and finds himself webbed up. Spidey wins the fight and Jonah looks distraught, except that Scorpion learns that he has pincer fingers and escapes, throwing the webbing back at Spider-Man. As the fight rages on, Dr. Stillwell realizes that his experiment will lead to Mac Gargan becoming more and more evil as he becomes more powerful. He races out with an antidote to stop the monster he created, but that very monster has defeated Spider-Man already and throws his unconscious body into an empty water tower. Then, feeling unbeatable, he proceeds to ignore Jonah and robs an armored car. Jonah has created a monster worse than Spider-Man. Speaking of Spider-Man, our hero awakes and chases after Scorpion, but Dr. Stillwell has found Scorpion first. He pleads with Mac to take the antidote, but Gargan refuses. In his attempt to save Mac, Dr. Stillwell climbs after him and falls to his death. The Scorpion grows stronger, the last of his humanity leaving his mind. He's so strong that he defeats Spider-Man a second time, once again leaving him for dead. There's only one thing left for Scorpion to do: kill the man who knows his identity. Kill J. Jonah Jameson. Lucky for Jonah, Spidey rallies a second time and comes to the rescue. He webs Scorpion's feet to the ground and uses the distraction to rip the tail from Scorpion's body. Even when Scorpion's pincer hands grab him, he moves into the blow instead of away and catches Mac Gargan with a knockout blow. Spider-Man has won, finally. As he recovers at home and sews up his costume, J. Jonah Jameson is out there pretending that he was the one that saved the city from Scorpion and vows to find another way to defeat Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man issue 21. A man named Abner Jenkins is being released from prison after serving his time. He's an old villain of the Human Torch named the Beetle, and when Johnny finds out about the release, he leaves his date to search for the villain. As he searches the city, Spider-Man is also out swinging. While people recoil at the sight of Spidey, they seem to love Torch, who makes fire hearts to wow the crowd. In the end, Johnny's search is fruitless, and he doesn't find the Beetle, and that's because the Beetle is following him. Johnny returns to an icy reception from Doris Evans, his girlfriend. She's upset that he flamed on and left her, and so she gives him one final chance. No flaming on for 24 hours. Outside, the Beetle sees how much Doris means to Johnny, and a plan forms. The next day, Doris is out shopping when she has her parcels knocked out of her hand. Luckily, Peter Parker is around to help her. After she leaves, he notices that she's dropped her wallet in the confusion and returns it to her home. Doris invites Peter in for a Coke, which he gladly accepts. As Peter leaves, Johnny sees him and gets jealous when Doris says that she likes this boy Peter. He confronts Peter Parker and warns him to stay away, making Betty leave, thinking that Peter is seeing other women behind her back. Parker snaps at the torch and also leaves angry. But maybe, just maybe, he can get his revenge. If Doris likes Parker so much, she's gonna love Spider-Man. But instead, he interrupts the Beetle in a kidnapping plot, and they fight outside the house. Doris rings the Human Torch for help, but he thinks she's just joking, trying to get him to flame on and lose the bet. He hangs up on her just as Spidey and the Beetle smash through a window. The Beetle, to keep Spider-Man away, grabs Doris, and he's able to escape with her. Spider-Man gives chase just as Johnny returns home. With Johnny Storm blaming Spider-Man for the missing Doris, the two fight above the city. Elsewhere, Betty is sure that there must be some explanation for Peter seeing other girls, so she rings him at home, only to have Aunt May say that she hasn't seen her nephew all day. Oh, Betty is sure that he must be cheating. If only she knew that he was fighting the Human Torch, leading the flamed hero to where the Beetle was. When the Torch spots the Beetle, he sees who's really to blame, and the two heroes work together to apprehend the Beetle once more. Doris is so happy to see Johnny, but she fears Spider-Man, so he swings away angry. Our issue ends with Spider-Man stood above the city, wishing for a day when people would see him as a real hero. Amazing Spider-Man issue 22. Remember the evil circus that hypnotized Spider-Man? Well, he certainly does, and since they're out of prison, he shows up to warn them off committing any more crimes. And while he does, he slips a tracker into the ringmaster's hypno hat. But the circus troupe doesn't want to work for the ringmaster anymore, so they hold a coup. The clown throws juggling balls at him, the human cannibal slams into him, and the acrobats toss him around. Princess Python votes to put the clown in charge. After school, Peter Parker is invited by Betty to attend an art exhibition sponsored by J. Jonah Jameson. While there, and while Jonah is boasting about being a patron of the arts, a clown shows up and distracts the crowds. As he does, the other members of the circus loot the back room. Jonah discovers the thievery, and the human cannibal slams into his head as a reward, knocking him out and into critical condition. Suspecting the ringmaster, Spider-Man follows his tracker, only to find that the ringmaster is innocent. However, he continues to follow him and discovers the truth of the situation. Spider-Man hypnotizes the ringmaster with his own hat to get the address of his ex-crime buddies, and he leaves the villain in a trance. At their hideout, the circus are deciding on a team name. They have just chosen the Masters of Menace when Spider-Man bursts into the room. Each member of the circus fights Spidey, but none are able to hold him until Princess Python holds onto his arms using her womanly charms. Spider-Man can't hit a woman, so he's basically powerless. Elsewhere, the hypnotizing hat keeping the ringmaster in trance falls and he wakes up. Also elsewhere, Betty gets the good news that Jonah will be okay. Back at the fight, Spider-Man continues to demonstrate how outmatched the Masters of Menace are. He takes particular pains to deal with the cannonball, crushing his helmet as revenge for Jonah. With the circus defeated, it's only Princess Python left. She flirts with him, almost takes off his mask, and then uses a taser to lure him into a room with a giant snake. No wonder she's called Princess Python. As Spider-Man battles the snake, literally tying it in knots, the clown is making his getaway with the stolen paintings. But then the ringmaster shows up and steals the paintings from the clown. And then the police show up and blame the ringmaster. Everyone is arrested, and Spider-Man is even able to get some photographs. Photos that he gifts to the newly recovered Jonah. Back at home, late at night, Peter returns to find Aunt May waiting up for him. She's angry and she's hurt that he's been keeping secrets from her, and all Peter can say is, well, it's hard to explain. Amazing Spider-Man issue 23. The Green Goblin is back and looking to take over Lucky Lobo's gang. When Lucky Lobo himself refuses, Goblin drops a distraction bomb and flees. The whole thing is caught by a journalist who figures that the Green Goblin must be taking down the mob. Later and elsewhere, Peter is having laundry issues. His Spider-Man suit is not dry, so he leaves it hanging in the attic. As he leaves for the Bugle, he promises Aunt May that he'll call if he'll be late. And at the Daily Bugle, he discovers a letter on Betty's desk from Europe, from her old boyfriend Ned Leeds. When Betty doesn't mention the letter, he assumes she must be hiding something from him. In Jonah's office, Parker learns that Jonah has rehired Frederick Foswell, the man formerly known as Big Man. Peter doesn't trust this ex-criminal, but when he goes to follow him as Spider-Man, he's reminded that his suit is still at home. In a dry suit, the Green Goblin meets with one of Lucky Lobo's gang, who gives him evidence of Lobo's illegal activities. Then, at a business executives club, Jonah is smoking with friends, including the first appearance of somebody in particular, when Foswell arrives to give him the evidence that the Goblin had gathered. With his costume now dry, Spider-Man witnesses the raid on one of Lobo's warehouses. But before he can stop some of the gang from escaping, the Green Goblin stops them instead. Maybe he is one of the good guys. Spider-Man follows him to be sure. However, the ever-alert Goblin spots him and decides that he can use Spider-Man to help his plan. He flies to Lucky Lobo's apartment, throws some smoke and leaves. By the time that Spider-Man realizes that he's not helping Goblin take down a gang, he's already surrounded. He fights them all, leaping to the ceiling and gluing their feet to the floor before taking refuge in another room. He webs up the door, keeping the gang at bay while he makes a phone call to his Aunt May, just letting her know that he'll be late home. He's such a good nephew. When the gang finally break down the door, they find Spider-Man surrendering with his hands up, but as they cautiously approach, they're caught by a web falling from the ceiling. Only Lucky Lobo escapes, because he's lucky, and he reveals that the Green Goblin has been trying to take over the gangs, not just fight crime. Spider-Man goes after the Goblin, forcing him through a skylight and into close quarters. Their fight uses up all of the Goblin's gadgets and he flees, but it also uses up all of Spidey's webs and he can't chase after the Goblin. Green Goblin thinks he's won, only to learn on the radio that the whole gang has been arrested thanks to Spider-Man. The whole gang? That means there's nothing left to take over. Peter Parker ends his day back at the Bugle, where he remains suspicious of Foswell, where he invokes the anger of Jonah for not having photos, and where he's passive-aggressive to Betty, who still hasn't mentioned the letter from Europe. At home, he thinks about everything that has gone right, but he still has this strange feeling, this foreboding feeling, that something terrible is just around the corner. Amazing Spider-Man issue 24. Things aren't going well for Peter Parker for 3 reasons. 1. His photos of Spider-Man beating up some bank robbers are unusable when Frederick Foswell shows up, who can clearly see that Parker wasn't there. 2. Betty is still writing letters to Ned Leeds in Europe. And 3. J. Jonah Jameson has started a new series where he interviews the public about what they hate most about Spider-Man, and after some heavy prompting, they're saying lots of mean things. The only person defending Spider-Man is Peter's bully, Flash Thompson, and the only upside to his life is that Liz Allen wants Parker to tutor her. At the Bugle, Jonah is visited by Dr. Ludwig Reinhardt, a psychiatrist from Europe. In his professional opinion, Spider-Man is a very sick man, living in a fantasy world. It's only a matter of time before he has a mental breakdown, and since it's bad news for Spider-Man, Jonah prints it on the front page. Worried that the doctor is right, Peter swings off to meet this Dr. Reinhardt, but when a cat walks past him, he's faced with a different doctor, Doc Ock, coming out of the wall to attack. When Spidey's grab doesn't connect, he discovers that the Ock is fake, only to have the Sandman rise from the ground. But he's also fake. As he tries to swing away, he passes a bat, and then he's attacked by the Vulture. But when Spidey tries to web him, he discovers a third fake. All these villains are fake. When he finally arrives at Dr. Reinhardt's office, he finds the whole office has been turned upside down and his past enemies are leaping out the wall at him. Spidey finally cracks. Meanwhile and elsewhere, Jonah gets some bad news about Dr. Reinhardt and rushes out of the office, only to bump into Flash Thompson, who's mad at Jonah for running all those negative hit pieces on his hero. On a therapist's couch, Spider-Man is about to reveal his secret identity when Jonah bursts into the room. Dr. Reinhardt is no doctor, he's a fraud! Reinhardt runs, and he's quickly caught by Spider-Man in the upside-down office, an office that was always upside down. He's unmasked to reveal Mysterio. Mysterio was using robotic cats and bats to project illusions to make Spider-Man think he was crazy, and he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that pesky newspaper editor. Jonah is upset that he stopped Spider-Man from being uncovered. Flash is happy that he got to save his hero, and Peter Parker's luck is looking up when he ends the night with Liz Allen to help her study, even if he's only doing it to get back at Betty for writing those letters to Ned. Amazing Spider-Man issue 25. Things are actually going well for Peter Parker. He's tutoring Liz Allen, he's sewing a spare costume, and he's captured some pictures of Spider-Man stopping a crime using only his signal light to attract the attention of the police. But his fortune changes when a scientist called Smythe comes into the Bugle with a robot. He says that it's guaranteed to defeat Spider-Man. Jonah initially rejects it, and ironically it's Peter Parker who convinces him to try it. After all, it's just a goofy looking robot. Turns out that the steel cables from that goofy looking robot are impossible to break out of, even with spider strength. And now Betty hates Peter too for wishing death on Spidey. As if things couldn't get any worse, Flash Thompson sees Pete with Liz and threatens to beat him up after class. That good luck really didn't last long. With his face and voice projected onto the robot, J. Jonah Jameson pilots the Spider Slayer and sets it off to detect any spiders in the local area. It finds Peter at school, and Peter makes a quick escape out the back. But Flash and friends thinks he's escaping from them and give chase, forcing Peter to climb up onto a rooftop to make his change into his alter ego. Every attack that Spider-Man tries against the robot fails. Liquid webbing falls off its oily body. Webbing just slides off too. The only thing Spidey can do now is run. At the Daily Bugle, Betty tries to save the hero, but her attempt to pull the plug on the controller is spotted by Jonah, and he throws her out. She decides to get Peter to help, since he was the one that suggested Jonah do this in the first place, and she heads to his house. Also heading to Peter's house is Flash and Liz. Flash wants to beat Pete up. Liz wants to stop that. The two groups meet, and Betty and Liz knock to find that Peter isn't home, but someone else is. Mary Jane Watson, that nice young girl that May wanted Peter to meet. We don't get to see her face, it's hidden by a flower, but both Betty and Liz thinks that she's movie star beautiful, and they both go their separate ways. Elsewhere, Spidey realizes that he can't just keep running, and he's quickly tangled in steel cables. He is trapped and at the mercy of this Spider Slayer. But since they can't risk transporting him, Jonah and Smythe have to leave the controls alone to unmask Spidey in person. Spider-Man has to do something before they arrive. Using his sticky fingers, he pries a panel loose. Now he just needs to use science to free himself. Jonah and Smythe arrive on the scene to find Spider-Man still struggling against the robot. Jonah pulls off Spidey's mask and finds nothing. The suit is empty, being puppeted by Peter Parker in the roof above. With his foes looking foolish and Flash moved on by the police, Peter arrives home to find Aunt May waiting for him. She's holding the spare Spider-Man costume that he sewed and asking for an explanation. Peter tells her that it was just a disguise to fool some friends. Look, he hasn't even worn it. May buys this but confiscates the costume, and Peter sighs. If she ever found out that he was Spider-Man, the shock would be fatal. Unfortunately, with Jonah having one of his costumes and May having his other one, he can't be Spider-Man until he finds some new threads. Amazing Spider-Man issue 26. Last issue, Spider-Man used one of his costumes as a puppet and had the other one confiscated by Aunt May, so now he's costumeless. Which is just a terrible time to happen because the Green Goblin and a brand new villain, the Crime Master, are meeting at the docks. They want to work together to take control of the gangs of New York, but both have ego issues and refuse to cooperate. Instead, the Crime Master goes on a rampage, threatening gang members and bombing cars. His message is clear: follow the Crime Master or suffer the consequences. As Crime Master's evening of terror comes to a close, we jump to the apartment of Frederick Foswell. You remember him from being the big man and going to jail. The journalist that's now working at the Daily Bugle. Well, he's taking off a costume and hoping that no one guesses his secret identity. And speaking of the Daily Bugle, Peter heads there the next day when his search for the Spidey costume confiscated by his aunt turns up nothing. In the middle of the press room, he has a big row with Betty, who is mad that he tried to get Spider-Man killed and mad that Peter's dating this mysterious Mary Jane Watson. Any amount of "I've never even met this girl" is ignored, and eventually the fight is ended by Jonah. As Jonah then goes on to brief Foswell on a story about this new Crime Master character, Peter sneaks a spider tracer into Foswell's hat. He's still suspicious of this ex-criminal, and he'll follow up when he has his costume back. At Midtown High, Flash Thompson and friends taunt Peter Parker for running away from a fight, the thing he did last issue. When the taunts get too much, Peter gets violent and a brawl starts. Liz, who thought Peter was different, is turned off from her Parker crush, and the fight is spotted by the principal, who calls Peter into his office. While Pete's in that office, Flash overhears Parker taking full responsibility for the fight that Flash and his gang started, and maybe he starts to gain a little respect for his classmate. Unseen by Peter, Flash tells the principal what really happened. Meanwhile and elsewhere, Jonah is at the Century Club, bragging about what a good person he is for rehiring Frederick Foswell despite his ex-criminal past, apparently completely unaware of dramatic irony. After school, Peter Parker figures out a solution to all of his costume woes. He just buys a suit from a costume shop. However, the Spider-Man suit they have just doesn't fit right, so he has to use webbing to keep it from revealing too much. Spider-Man once again, Parker follows follows his spider tracer to Foswell's apartment, only to find it abandoned. As he searches for clues to Foswell's criminality, the crime master appears on the rooftops outside. The crime master shoots at the person inside Foswell's apartment and continues to shoot more as he learns that he's facing Spider-Man. When bullets are easily dodged, crime master uses a knockout gas instead, and Spidey finds himself choking and tumbling off the edge of the building. As he falls, he's able to get his mask off and breathe once more, and then able to use his reflexes to save himself from a certain splattery death. With crime master escaped and no Foswell at his apartment, Peter swings to the Daily Bugle to find him there. He doesn't find Foswell, but he does bump into Jonah, who tells him that Smythe has his costume, and Spider-Man desperately needs it because his fake one is riding up. To stop his mask revealing his secret identity, he webs it shut. He then swings back to Foswell's apartment. This time, he isn't shot at and finds a map of the waterfront. At that very waterfront, gangs are gathering for a meeting to join the crime master, but one of their members, a man called Patch on account of his eye patch, betrays them and informs the police. Elsewhere, but close by, the crime master is meeting with the Green Goblin once more. They both threaten each other with their secret identities, and those threats lead to violence. Fleeing the scene, the Green Goblin finds Spider-Man lurking nearby. With stealth and speed, he flies down from above, so quick that even Spidey's spider sense can't save him. To finish him off, the Green Goblin throws a bomb towards him. Spidey is quick enough to avoid a fatal hit, not quick enough to avoid being knocked unconscious. The Green Goblin has Spider-Man at his mercy, and he's finally able to reveal his secret identity. Well, he would if the mask wasn't web shut. Instead, he has other plans. As the crime master gets on stage to announce his takeover of the gangs, the Green Goblin also gets on stage, but has something better to offer. He has captured Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man issue 27. Last issue, the Green Goblin captured Spider-Man and interrupted the Crime Master's bid to take over the gangs. Those very gangs quickly chain Spider-Man up and their loyalty switches. They follow the Green Goblin now. The only person who doesn't is Patch, our resident police informer. As the gangs decide what to do with him, Spidey wakes up and wishes he hadn't. Even though he's wrapped in chains, he's able to fight back against the gangs, leaping over bullets and goblin blasts so they hit each other rather than him. Just as Spidey is losing momentum, the police arrive. They're heavily outnumbered, but their arrival grants enough of a distraction for Spider-Man to flex free of his chains. With use of all of his limbs, the fight is soon won by Spider-Man. He even has time to set up his camera. The gang members surrender, the Green Goblin escapes, and backup arrives thanks to Patch sneaking out to alert the police. Since the Green Goblin is on a glider, Spider-Man chases after the Crime Master instead. The chase leads under the harbour and into a sewer pipe, which is where Crime Master fires off nerve gas. Spider-Man is ready this time though, and crafts himself a protective mask with his webs. But by the time he's able to make it through the gas, the Crime Master's long gone in the sewers, and there's just too many directions that he could have gone. Spider-Man has lost him. Since the harbour is now empty, Spidey goes back to Foswell's apartment instead. He's sure that Foswell has something to do with all of this. His search uncovers a secret compartment in Foswell's wardrobe. It's empty now, but it's the perfect place to store a Green Goblin and/or Crime Master outfit. Spider-Man is convinced. Foswell is the Green Goblin and/or the Crime Master. He travels to the Daily Bugle to deliver the news to Jonah. But of course Jonah doesn't believe him. In fact, he calls Frederick Foswell into his office and directly asks him, "Are you the Green Goblin and/or the Crime Master?" And since Foswell says no, the case is closed. Spidey would argue further, but a gunfight is happening on the roof opposite. The actual Crime Master is going to shoot at Foswell, but the cops stop him. The gunfight leads to the Crime Master's death, and his dying words are almost the identity of the Green Goblin. Almost. At the Bugle, the cops arrive to thank Foswell. Since he was an old gangster, he was able to figure out who this new player was. He'd told the cops and also acted as bait for them to catch him. So who was the Crime Master? Nick Lucky Lewis, a character who's not been mentioned at all. Sometimes the big reveal is just somebody you've never heard about. Since Spider-Man is in his office, Jonah tells the cops to arrest him for crimes, and when they refuse, he threatens a front-page story about Foswell to make Spider-Man look like a fool. Which reminds Spidey, he left his camera. He swings back to the pier, only to find the camera missing. As he searches, a rotten plank sends him tumbling into the water, but he's able to find his camera in the hands of some children and swings away with most of his dignity intact. However, because of the water, his costume shop costume is shrinking, so he removes it on a rooftop until he can find a better solution. At home, he develops his pictures of the warehouse fight, but he doesn't want to sell it to Jonah, not after the way he was just treated. Instead, he goes to the Daily Globe and sells them there, although he's put off by how nosy the editor Barney Bushkin is. At his gentleman's club, Jonah is bragging about this big story and his reporter's involvement. In fact, he claims he was the mastermind behind the whole thing. His mood is only slightly dampened by the news that the Daily Globe got exclusive Parker-produced photographs. house. At home, and with Aunt May out of the house, Peter continues his search for his real costume. When that turns up nothing, he realizes that his worst nightmare has come true. He'll have to sew another. But that'll have to wait, because Aunt May arrives home after her evening plans are cancelled. Missing his aunt, Peter offers her a trip with him to the theatre. As they watch the film, Boswell returns to his apartment. He's glad that no one realized his real secret identity, Patch, the police informant. And elsewhere, the Green Goblin rages that Spider-Man stopped him once again. He vows to disappear, just long enough for Spidey to think him beaten, and then strike once more to destroy Spider-Man for good. But Peter's unaware of all of that. He's enjoying the evening with his aunt by his side. He's happy. The Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 2. Our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is swinging around New York, bored. There are just no crimes happening. But little does he know that a mysterious stranger is entering a bar mid-brawl. The stranger clocks the two strongest men in the room and uses magic to hypnotize them. They work for him now, Xandu. He gets them to demonstrate how strong they are under his control and how they feel no pain, and then he sends them after Doctor Strange to steal the other half of the Wand of Watum, a powerful magic artifact. In his Sanctum Sanctorum, Doctor Strange is attacked by the two men. He tries to use spells to affect their minds, but finds their minds empty. He tries to use illusion to create multiple versions of himself, but Xandu guides them to the real Strange. In the end, Doctor Strange loses and is knocked unconscious. As the two men leave with the stolen half of the wand, Spider-Man intercepts them. He thinks it'll be an easy fight, but soon finds himself overpowered, unable to do any damage to these men who don't feel pain. Even his webs are useless against him as they tear them off. He's knocked down and the men leave, but not before Spidey can attach a spider tracer to them. The tracer leads Spidey to Xandu, who has attached the wand halves together to create a deadly weapon. But it's a deadly weapon that Spidey is able to get away from him with surprise and webbing before Xandu throws him into another dimension. Trapped in this strange void, Spidey is attacked by the two men from before. He knows what he's up against now, but he also needs them to show him how to get out of this strange world. Meanwhile, Doctor Strange awakens and uses a spell to track his missing wand. He finds Xandu and confronts him, just as Xandu's two henchmen arrive back with Spider-Man in their clutches. Turns out he needed to get caught to find a way back. As Spidey fights off the henchmen, Doctor Strange faces off against Xandu, but with the wand back in Xandu's grasp, the fight quickly turns against Strange, who astral projects away from his physical body to convince Xandu that he's defeated. As a spirit, he incepts an idea into Spider-Man's head that he can use two exposed wires to shock the henchmen awake. And it works! Spidey picks up on the message and shocks the men, and suddenly they're just two confused people standing around once more. Doctor Strange rushes back to his body, and alongside Spider-Man he fights against Xandu. Able to attack from both sides and dodge the wand attacks, they easily disarm their foe, webbing his hands so that he cannot reach for the wand. Knowing now how dangerous the Wand of Watum is, Doctor Strange uses his amulet to drain it of all power. He then uses a spell to read Xandu's past and then wipes his memory clean of all his evil. As he leaves, the Doctor thanks Spider-Man for his help and offers his friendship if the need should ever arise. Spidey is convinced that he won't believe any of this in the morning. Amazing Spider-Man issue 28. It's graduation day for Peter Parker, and seniors are finishing early to get into gowns and hats. Everyone is excited, except for Liz Allen, who is cold to both Peter and Flash. But before Peter can get into his graduation outfit, he's got to find a different spider-themed outfit first. With that in mind, he arrives at Smythe's house with a package under his arm. As photographer Peter Parker, he gets inside to look at the Spider Slayer that he fought a few issues back. But when he does, the robot attacks him, tangling him in tentacles. Why would it do that, wonders Smythe. It only attacks spiders. That's when Peter unveils his package, a jar of spiders to help Smythe with his studies. He's also glad that he thought ahead and protected his secret identity. With the robot deactivated, Smythe allows Peter to look at the Spider-Man costume so that he can take photos for the bugle while he goes to answer the door. Peter doesn't look at the costume though, he swaps it out for the costume shop variant he bought a few issues back. And he's about to leave when he sees who's at the door. It's Mark Raxton, Smythe's science partner. Raxton wants the inventions they've been working on, a liquid metal alloy that is worth a fortune. But Smythe argues that it hasn't been tested, that it could be dangerous, and the two men come to blows. Smythe falls into the machinery, activating the Spider Slayer once more and trapping Peter. While Raxton topples and finds himself covered in the liquid metal alloy, he flees to get to a hospital, and Peter uses his web shooter to deactivate the robot before Smythe becomes conscious and discovers who he really is. As Raxton races to get help, he finds that the metal doesn't hurt. In fact, he feels strong, and he smashes a car just to prove it. He's an actual molten man. And so he does what all all good molten men do, and he plans to do the biggest crime he can think of. But before he can even think about any crimes, Spider-Man arrives on the scene, having gotten Raxton's address from Smythe. The two men fight, and Spidey quickly finds that Raxton can survive his hardest punches, and that his webs just slide off Raxton's metal body. Spidey is out of options and taking heavy metal hits, and is soon sent tumbling into a cellar. Once there, Spidey has an idea. He takes out the lights and uses his spider sense to maneuver in the dark. He's able to web together a thick rope with his webs and hog-tie the Molten Man. In the light again, the Molten Man is able to fight back, but Spider-Man holds on long enough for the web to harden, now unbreakable. Soon the police arrive, and Spider-Man swings off to his graduation. All of Peter's classmates have gathered for his graduation. Aunt May watches on as he collects his diploma, and we learn that Peter has won a science scholarship to the Empire State University for having the best grades in the school's history, and that Flash Thompson has won one for sports. After J. Jonah Jameson delivers a self-centered speech and woos Aunt May afterwards, Peter checks in with Liz about her sour mood. She admits to liking Peter a lot, and sad that he always preferred other girls. Sad too that he just saw her as a dizzy blonde. She wants to graduate out of that perception and become someone new. As Liz leaves with her parents, Jonah takes a few digs at Peter for selling his photos to a different newspaper. Then it's just Peter, his Aunt May and Mrs. Watson, and they walk off past the school which houses so many memories. But this isn't really an ending, it's the beginning of a new chapter. The Amazing Spider-Man issue 29. The Scorpion has escaped from prison. By pretending to crack up, he convinced the guards to give him back his suit, which he fixed and used to escape, and now he's swearing vengeance on J. Jonah Jameson and Spider-Man. Meanwhile and elsewhere at the Daily Bugle, Jonah is asking Foswell about the cat burglar and some missing scientific equipment, teasing future stories, and Peter Parker learns that Ned Leeds is back and flirting with Betty Brant. As Peter fumes, the police arrive to warn Jonah about the Scorpion's escape. Trying to hide his involvement in the creation of the Scorpion, Jonah plays it off like he's not worried. Why would the Scorpion come after him? But alone, he's terrified and comes up with a plan to convince Spider-Man to save him. But since Peter Parker was at the Bugle and heard about the escape, Spider-Man is already helping. He's swinging around hoping to attract the Scorpion and completely unaware that he's having the opposite effect, showing the Scorpion that Jonah is alone and unguarded. Jonah's plan to use a newspaper headline to taunt Spidey into defeating the Scorpion goes into action, but it's too late. The Scorpion attacks Jonah at the Bugle and the fight spills out into the bullpen. Luckily, Spidey realizes his mistake just in time and swings through the window to the rescue. Spidey battles the Scorpion, but he's angry when he sees that Ned gets to protect Betty, and that anger makes him sloppy, missing punches and taking hits. Jonah yells at him to defeat the Scorpion, and then yells at him when he isn't able to, and when the police arrive, Jonah yells at them to shoot both Scorpion and Spider-Man. The Scorpion flees up the side of the building, followed by Spider-Man, and Jonah is left standing in the wreckage of the fight. He wastes no time and immediately gets photographs and makes himself out to be a hero, while Ned Leeds takes a distraught Betty home. On the rooftop, Spidey turns his webs into bowlers and uses them to trap the Scorpion, but using his coiled tail, the Scorpion is able to springboard off a wall and sends the two of them tumbling off the rooftop. Spider-Man is able to save them both, but they fall into the water, where Spidey has to quickly change his web fluid and unloads on the Scorpion. Spidey's increased lung capacity means that he can stay underwater longer, and eventually he drags up a webbed up Scorpion and leaves him on the dock for the police to find. At home, Peter Parker tries to call Betty, but finds Ned at her home instead. Sad and distracted, he doesn't notice Aunt May having a dizzy spell in the kitchen, and she just says that she dropped a glass when asked about it. She doesn't want to worry Peter. If she was gone, who would look after the poor, lonely boy? Amazing Spider-Man, issue 30. As Spider-Man is swinging through the city of New York, he doesn't spot the cat burglar, a thief who has been stealing things from all over the city. And so he doesn't stop that very same cat burglar from stealing everything from a safe belonging to J. Jonah Jameson. Well, if the police can't catch this cat burglar, then Jonah will offer a $1,000 reward to anybody who does capture him. Meanwhile and across town, a delivery of uranium is attacked by a gang dressed in purple. They say, out loud, that their plan was all the cat's idea. Spider-Man swings in to stop them, but they swerve the lorry while all wearing magnet boots, and the magnetless Spider-Man falls off and loses them. As he searches the city to find his missing uranium thieves, Spidey overhears news about Jonah's $1,000 reward. He pops round to the Daily Bugle to taunt Jonah, teasing that he's gonna find the cat burglar and collect that reward first, leaving Jonah having nightmarish visions about being paraded into the street and mocked by a Spider-Man with teeth. So Jonah calls Foswell, instructing his reporter to find the cat burglar before Spider-Man does. The next day, as Peter sets out in search of that very burglar, he runs into Liz Allen for the first time since graduation. She's going to a job and asks Peter to delay Flash Thompson, who's following Liz. Peter does just that, even knocking Flash out temporarily to stop a crime. Elsewhere, Betty has been told something surprising by Ned Leeds, so when Peter calls, she invites him over. She tells him that Ned has proposed. Peter instantly thinks of also proposing and revealing his secret identity, but bringing up Spider-Man even just a little bit causes Betty to flinch away. That leaves Peter angry enough to storm out, leaving Betty crying that it's Peter that she really loves. As he wanders sadly through the streets, Peter runs into a robbery and stops it as Spider-Man. The goons were hired by the purple-clad men from earlier, who will just have to find a way to deal with this Spider-Man menace. This doesn't matter this issue, but it's going to come back later. At home, Aunt May is still hiding fainting spells from Peter, and he learns that Betty has called him many times, but instead he sinks depressed in front of the TV. Across town, the cat burglar is pulling off one last job before retiring. Unfortunately, he chooses a building that already had its windows cleaned, so a resident spots the strange man hanging outside. Suddenly, the police are shining spotlights up at him, and Spider-Man's arriving to apprehend him. Elsewhere, with the arrival of Spider-Man, Jonah is watching nervously on the news. He really doesn't want to pay $1,000 to Spider-Man. Spidey and the cat burglar fight on the rooftop, with the cat burglar using explosives and guns, enough to force Spider-Man to temporarily withdraw to avoid getting shot. But as Spider-Man takes a breather, the police arrive and find the cat burglar hiding in a chimney. They arrest him, and Peter is left just to take pictures of the scene instead. He delivers these photographs to a very relieved Jonah, who even pays extra since he no longer has to pay out on a reward. As he leaves, he bumps into Betty, but there's something between them now, a Spider-Man presence that will mean that they can never be together. Amazing Spider-Man issue 31. Those mysterious purple men who we've been meeting many times before are working for the Master Planner and stealing radioactive devices and escaping by helicopter. At least they would be escaping if Spider-Man didn't interrupt. The purple men fire gas at Spidey, but he just holds his breath, relying on his superhuman constitution to survive. And since they can't beat Spidey in a fair fight, the men dump their spoils into the water below. And, unspotted by Spider-Man, those spoils are picked up and taken to an underwater base. On the helicopter, the gas is starting to get to Spidey, so he ends the fight quickly by throwing the door of the helicopter at the rotor blades and bringing the whole thing down into the water. Spidey tries to rescue the purple criminals, but finds them escaped. In the underwater base, the Master Planner is frustrated by Spider-Man. By accident, Spidey is ruining all of the Master Planner's master plans. Later, Peter Parker is off to register at his new college, saying goodbye to May, who's feeling very ill but refusing to worry her nephew. So he registers, signs out books, and gets insulted by Flash Thompson, all while oblivious to his aunt's health. But it becomes very clear when he returns home after she faints and is rushed into hospital. Despite May urging Peter to rest for his first day of school, he spends the whole night worrying, and so he's exhausted at college the next day. Flash Thompson meets fellow students Harry Osborn and Gwen Stacy, but when they all try to say hi to Peter, he's still full of worry and exhaustion, and he blanks the trio. It's a terrible first impression, and Harry starts spreading rumours that Peter is cold to everybody. Gwen's starting to develop a crush though. In science class, Harry and his gang decide to play a prank to take Peter down a peg or two. They replace his inert chemicals with something showy, getting him in trouble with the professor. Peter doesn't even realise it's a prank though, thinking he must have just used the wrong chemical while in his own head. Feeling sorry for Peter, Gwen encourages Harry to invite Peter for sodas, but he blanks them again as he races to see Aunt May. At the hospital, Peter is told that the doctors still don't know what's wrong, and at home, bills are piling up. How can he possibly afford all this healthcare? He briefly considers dropping out of school, but decides on more immediate action. So he swings off as Spider-Man, looking for crime to photograph and sell pictures of, but he finds nothing. The night is a bust. He goes home and falls asleep over his studies, and so he's a zombie once again the next day at school, and his classmates continue to gossip about him. Meanwhile and elsewhere, J. Jonah Jameson is cursing the lack of news, yelling at Foswell to bring him a story about the stolen nuclear equipment, and Ned asks Betty if she has an answer for him yet. Will she marry him? But she's waiting to learn Peter's secret first. And later, Foswell is dressed as Patch, doing what Jonah wanted, and discovers that a very stealable shipment of nuclear equipment is heading heading into the city tonight. At college, Gwen is getting frustrated that Peter's the only guy that hasn't looked at her in any way, so she goes into full flirting mode, only to have Peter race past her, keen to get to the hospital quicker to spend longer there. He'll pay for that, she threatens. And they still don't know what's wrong with Aunt May, and so Peter swings as Spider-Man, looking for a payday. Instead, he bumps into Patch, secretly Foswell, who informs Spidey of the robbery planned that night. With nothing better to do, Spider-Man checks it out. He finds the Purple Men again, stealing from a cargo ship. When they spot him, they try the gas once more, but Peter has taken precautions this time, and the gas is ineffective. He fights the men, using the ship's boom to bowl them over, and then webs up the crates that they try to dunk into the water. But before Spidey can take pictures, the Purple Men flee into the ocean, and Spider-Man is left with no information at all. He stopped the robbery, but he can't exactly make money from an empty harbour. But we do learn that he's built his own gas mask underneath his Spidey mask. At the underwater base, the Master Planner monologues once again, and we learn 3 things. There's somebody who has fought Spider-Man before, they're building some kind of laser, and they want to deal with this Spider-Man menace once and for all. And elsewhere, at the hospital, the doctors have finally found out what's wrong with Aunt May, and it means that she's going to die very soon. Amazing Spider-Man issue 32. In an underwater base, the Master Planner curses Spider-Man, and we finally learn who they are. Dr. Octopus, who wants to use radiation to become one of the most feared humans in the world. He just needs a few more pieces of equipment and orders his men to steal anything radioactive coming into the city. On the surface, Peter Parker is at the Daily Bugle to sell photographs when he bumps into Betty and Ned Leeds. Since Betty will never love him as Spider-Man, he decides to play the cad, claiming Betty was just good for a few laughs and getting physical with Ned when he tries to get Peter to be nice to Betty. This approach will hurt Betty, he thinks, but hopefully it'll get her to move on from Peter. But she refuses to move on. She knows that he's not really like this. With Betty still pining after him, Peter arrives at the hospital to visit his sick aunt. There, a doctor tells Peter what the problem is. Somehow, radioactivity has gotten into her bloodstream. The doctors are baffled about how it could have happened, but Peter thinks he knows. It was the blood transfusion that he gave her months ago. Somehow, the radioactivity that turned him into Spider-Man is killing his aunt. At home, Peter wrecks the place in anger, thinking himself responsible for both of his parent figures dying. But he has to do something, and he knows just the person who'll help. Dr. Kurt Connors, the man formerly known as the Lizard. And lucky for Peter, Connors has recently moved from Florida to New York. So as Spider-Man, Peter steals his aunt's blood sample and races to Dr. Connors, explaining the issues that a friend is having. And Connors has a solution, a radioactive chemical known as ISO-36. It's expensive, but Spidey says he'll find a way to afford it and asks Connors to get some as soon as possible. And to afford it, Peter Parker pawns off all of his scientific equipment. Unfortunately, the ISO-36 is stolen by the Master Planner's gang as it arrives by plane. When Spidey learns about the theft, he knows immediately who's responsible, but doesn't know where the Master Planner is hiding. So he swings to the Bugle looking for Foswell, scaring Betty in the process, and finds Foswell in the streets below. He tells him to find out who the Master Planner is, and that he'll share the story with him, and then he swings away for a hunt of his own. Spider-Man tears apart gang after gang, looking for information, no longer the quippy hero and instead a whirlwind of violence. The kid gloves are off as Aunt May slips into a coma. Eventually, Spidey discovers a secret door that leads to a group of Purple Men that work with the Master Planner. Spidey takes them apart easily and finds reinforcements coming through another hidden door, so he jumps through that just in time in search for the ISO-36. But little does he know that he's walking into the Master Planner's trap. Spider-Man finds his way into a large room filled with machinery and with the ISO-36 on easy display, but when he moves towards it, he's electrocuted and falls to the ground. Dr. Octopus springs his surprise, ready to defeat Spider-Man, but he doesn't account for a Spidey on a timescale with a dying aunt, and our superhero fights back hard and relents little. Spidey is so vicious that Doc Ock flees, but also so vicious that he smashes the main support beam for the equipment and it all falls down on top of him. Trapped under this equipment, some of it weighing as much as a locomotive, Spider-Man is inches away from the ISO-36. He watches as water begins to drip from the ceiling, the river above ready to flood in, powerless to stop it. He is lost, too weak and too tired to lift anything off of himself. Elsewhere, his dying aunt whispers his name. Elsewhere, Doc Connors frets that they're running out of time for the antidote to work. Elsewhere, Purple Men guard the exit to the chamber, and Spider-Man sinks down in defeat. He has failed. Amazing Spider-Man issue 33. So let's recap. Aunt May is dying in the hospital. The cure for her illness is being manufactured by Dr. Connors, but he needs one final ingredient. That ingredient, ISO 36, is just an arm lengths away from Spider-Man. Unfortunately, the room he's in is starting to flood, and there are guards at the door, and he's trapped under tons of equipment. This issue is called the final chapter for a reason. Except, even though he's defeated, Spider-Man can't help but think about his Aunt May, and how he's our only hope, and how he let his Uncle Ben down, and within himself, despite all the odds, he begins to rise. The stress of tons of metal is enormous. The feat, almost impossible. He's close to blacking out from the strain, but little by little Spider-Man lifts tons of machinery from himself before breaking himself free, a hero once more. But his leg is badly wounded and the room is flooding fast. With the ISO 36 in hand, Spidey decides that there's no use fighting, going limp and letting the water carry him when it bursts into the room instead. Using his agility, he avoids the debris in the water, and at the last moment before drowning, he surfaces for air. Except he's pulled back into the water by those purple men that work for the Master Planner, and even though he can defeat them by pulling their air hoses out, he finds more waiting for him on the surface. He tries to fight, but he's outnumbered and weak and injured, and he falls under the weight of their blows. But as he falls, he thinks of his Aunt May again, waiting for him, and he fights on without thinking, defeating the purple men without even noticing, and then limps on to Dr. Connors. Spider-Man and Connors finish off the antidote, testing it on Spidey's blood to see if it works, before Spider-Man swings to the hospital and Connors calls ahead to let them know of Spidey's arrival. The doctors accept the antidote and perform a blood transfusion, but it'll be 2 hours before they know anything, and that's too long for Spider-Man to wait around and worry. So he swings back to the Master Planner's base to stage some photographs, then informs Foswell of the unconscious henchman and takes pictures of their arrest too. He's now square with Foswell, and Jonah is jubilant that his paper has the exclusive on the arrests. As Peter limps to Jonah's office to sell him the photographs, Betty chases him down, but when she finds him wounded from taking photographs and adamant that it's important to him, Betty falls out of love with Peter, reminded of her dead brother and his eagerness to put himself in danger. And in Jonah's office, Jonah is so desperate for the photographs that Peter took that Peter gets to negotiate a high price, enough for him to pay for May's medical bills and to buy back the equipment that Peter sold to get her the antidote. And then, with his business done, Peter's back at the hospital, and he learns that his aunt is fine, that her blood has come back clean. She's going to be okay. As she sleeps, Peter limps home exhausted, as the doctors wonder why more people can't be like this young kid Peter instead of the thrill seekers like Spider-Man. Amazing Spider-Man issue 34. Kraven the Hunter has a bust on his wall, waiting to wear a Spidey mask when Kraven finally hunts and kills the wallcrawler, and that's what he's going to do today, so he practices by drinking a magic potion and wrestling a lion. Elsewhere, Peter Parker reveals his secret identity to Betty, except that not really, it's just Betty having a nightmare. She consoles herself that there's no way that Peter could be Spider-Man, she just wishes that she could guess the actual secret that's keeping them apart. Later, at college, Gwen Stacy is beset with suitors, and Peter is finally ready to embrace the other students there. He was distant because his aunt was ill, but now that she's well and at home, Peter can finally make friends. Except that Harry Osborn just won't let him. Peter can't be cold and distant one moment and then just expect to be nice and have everything change. Gwen feels conflicted though. Maybe he had a reason to be distant, but she thinks that Peter's more interested in his science than a girl like her. At home time, Peter has to stop himself from stopping crime. He needs to be home with his recovering Aunt May, not Spider-Manning around the city. But that might all have to change because Kraven is plotting in the Chameleon's old lair. And, completely unconnected, Spider-Man, and definitely not Kraven in disguise, attacks J. Jonah Jameson in the streets. The public are disgusted. Spider-Man really is a criminal. And that's news for the real Spider-Man, who was relaxing at home with his aunt. But he can't go chasing after this imposter. He needs to look after May, especially since she's just recovered from having radioactive blood, which was not as fun as the theme song makes it sound. And so, while Peter is stuck at home, the spider imposter continues to harass Jonah over the coming days, and Jonah low-key loves it because he's now selling even more papers. Luckily for Peter, Mrs. Watson arrives one evening to chat with May, and he can sneak away to become his alter ego. But his hunt for the fake Spidey is not much of a hunt, because that fake Spidey wants to be found, shining a spider signal to draw the attention of Peter. It's so so obvious that a gang in the streets below see it and head up to the building to beat up that criminal Spider-Man and claim some of the reward. Spider-Man, the real one, reaches the rooftop where he saw the light, and the fake Spider-Man reveals himself to be Kraven, of course. Kraven sprays Spider-Man with a special pheromone spray designed to dull his spider sense, and then leads our hero onto a chase through a booby-trapped building, traps that Spider-Man can no longer sense. The chase leads down into the building where Spider-Man comes face to face with that gang from before, looking for a payday. Spider-Man fights the men that attack, and then escapes through a window, realizing too late that his dulled spider sense is tingling and getting grappled by Kraven. But there's more of the gang, so Spider-Man stops fighting Kraven, and Kraven stops fighting Spider-Man, so they can both take out the gang together. And with that gang finally defeated, Kraven gets the drop on Spider-Man, landing on him from above. But Spider-Man's jokey attitude enrages the Hunter, enough to make him sloppy, enough to let Spider-Man land just one blow. He follows that one blow up with more hits, and eventually Spider-Man triumphs over Kraven the Hunter. After webbing Kraven and the gang up for the police, Peter Parker thinks about taking pictures to sell to the Daily Bugle. But that would mean running into Betty Brant, and losing her is too much for him to deal with right now, so he goes home instead. Later, and because he is a man of honor, Kraven admits to impersonating Spider-Man, showing the evidence to the police. It drives J. Jonah Jameson angry. Once again, Spider-Man comes out looking like a hero. His anger is interrupted by his new secretary, hired because Betty quit suddenly? If only someone would tell Peter, who ends our story wallowing in his room, about his romance with Betty and the Spider-Man secret that is keeping them from being together. Amazing Spider-Man issue 35. Because the legal system in the Marvel Universe is broken, in a different way to the way it's broken in real life, Mark Raxton, also known as the Molten Man, is let out of prison. He celebrates by immediately committing a crime, robbing a jewelry store in a mask to disguise his golden skin. The shopkeeper tries to shoot him, and the bullet does little against a man made of metal, and Raxton smashes the shopkeeper's gun in his fist as revenge. But the gunshot is enough to draw Spider-Man's attention. When he arrives on the scene, Raxton pretends to surrender and then sucker punches Spidey and flees, losing Spider-Man and shedding his costume in the process. No one can tie the Molten Man to this robbery. Except, it seems, for Peter Parker, who thinks to himself that it was like hitting metal when he punched that strange man. Metal? The Molten Man. It all makes sense. So he sneaks into Mark Raxton's apartment when he isn't there and places a spider tracer on his suit. After a number of false positives, Spider-Man eventually finds the Molten Man committing another crime. He takes pictures of the whole affair, from the disguise to the way the Molten Man breaks the lock with his fist, before the spider signal announces Spider-Man's presence and he swings down to fight. The fight is literally an excuse to let the letterer Artie Simek go wild with sound effects, and amounts to Spider-Man and the Molten Man just punching each other backwards and forwards. Eventually, the Molten Man runs home, only to find Spider-Man has beat him there, so they fight again, just in a different location. Spidey has also prepared a web rope while he was waiting, and with some fancy leaping and dodging, he manages to hog tie the Molten Man, just like last time. But this time it's different, the Molten Man cries. There's no evidence that the Molten Man did anything. He was in disguise. But Raxton is soon proved wrong when Spider-Man delivers some newly developed photographs that show everything, including the Molten Man shedding his disguise. Later, at the Daily Bugle, Peter Parker is ready to sell the rest of those photographs and bracing himself to see Betty Brant again. But instead, he runs into Betty's replacement, who, at Betty's request, gives him back a photograph of himself. Peter is convinced that she's run off to marry Ned Leeds and looks down at the ironic inscription on the photograph. To Betty, forever, Peter. He throws it in the trash and leaves. Images of Betty haunting him. Amazing Spider-Man issue 36. A meteor falls from the sky and a man called Norton G. Fester discovers it. He thinks that a fortune will soon be his, as he can use the meteor to discover microscopic life from space. But because no one will pay him for his research, he decides just to hit it with a hammer and chisel. The meteor sprays him with a gas that makes him super strong and able to jump slightly higher than usual, and so he instantly turns to crime. Meanwhile and elsewhere, Peter Parker has noticed that all the kids have friendship groups, but he's been too busy fighting Kraven and the Molten Man to do any of this friendship thing. But he's ready to try now, and things are looking good when he gets chatting with Sally Green, a girl who doesn't believe the rumours about Peter being a jerk. In fact, she even made a bet with Gwen Stacy that he isn't that bad, and they're getting on well until she mentions how smart Peter is, and Peter starts acting like a jerk to her in response, because he can't have people just liking him for his smarts. That's what Betty did. It looks like Gwen was right all along. Across town, Norton G. Fester is calling himself the Looter. With his new powers and a device that flashes a bright light, he robs a bank, and then robs more and more in the following days. But soon the meteor is out of gas and he needs to find another one. Coincidentally, there's a meteor on display at the local museum. It's the same museum that Peter Parker is at, and also Gwen Stacy, who is following Peter, hoping that this will be a chance to get to know him more. So it's really unfortunate that the Looter strikes on that very day, and Gwen learns that Peter is a coward, who runs away at the first sign of danger. Little does she know that he'll be returning moments later as the Amazing Spider-Man. Spidey and the Looter fight one another, with the Looter putting exhibits in harm's way to distract Spider-Man and stop him from hitting him. Eventually, the Looter uses his flashing machine, blinding everybody in the room, except for Spider-Man, who closed his eyes under the mask. That good news for Spider-Man quickly turns bad when the Looter pushes over a large exhibit on top of the blinded patrons. Spider-Man is able to save the day, but not without losing the Looter. And when he becomes Peter Parker again, Gwen Stacy turns up her nose at this coward and continues to mock him at school the next day. Peter just can't win, but he does realise that the Looter left empty-handed, so he stakes out the museum. It pays off on the last day of the exhibit, and Spider-Man is there once more to stop the Looter from stealing the meteor. The Looter is ready though, and inflates a helium balloon, floating up, and away from our hero. But Spider-Man isn't done yet, and he uses a flagpole to catapult himself up to the escaping thief. At first, Spidey holds on with webs, and when they fail, he grabs hold of the Looter's foot, eventually swinging himself up to deliver one knockout blow. With the Looter defeated, Spider-Man unmasks him, makes fun of his looks, and then deflates the balloon so they both descend back to Earth. Just as the police arrive, Spider-Man escapes to the rooftops and takes pictures for tomorrow's paper. Amazing Spider-Man issue 37. A man named Professor Strom is released from prison, and he has only one thing on his mind: revenge. Watching this from the trees is Frederick Foswell, current journalist for the Daily Bugle and Professor Strom's ex-cellmate. He knows that Professor Strom is planning something, so when Strom gets into a car driven by another ex-inmate, Max Young, Foswell decides to tail them. Watching this from even more trees is just another guy who wants to get in the good graces of Strom by shooting Foswell. But Spider-Man intervenes with a fist. Spidey gets the guy to tail Foswell, who is tailing Strom. But before we can add another layer of tailing to this tail-heavy opening, the police pull Spidey's car over, what with it being stolen, and Spider-Man leaves this criminal driver to the police, losing Foswell in the process. And at the Daily Bugle, Foswell reveals that he also lost Professor Strom. Knowing that Foswell will keep up the search though, Peter slips a spider tracer in his hat. At school, Peter is confronted by an angry Gwen Stacy, and he somehow angrily flirts with her enough that she starts to warm to him. And when Flash threatens to beat Peter up, and Peter calmly walks away, Gwen sees that he wasn't afraid at all. Elsewhere, the first step of Professor Strom's revenge is ready to test. A robot that looks like a green tentacled monster. He uses it to break into the lab of the person he wants revenge on, hoping to cause lots of monetary damage. Spider-Man is, unfortunately, nearby, and he swings in to help any trapped victims of a fire that is now growing. He doesn't get much time to be baffled by this new green robot, as he quickly finds himself tangled in the robot's tentacles. With the green robot pinning him down, Spidey does the only thing he can think of, rolling them both towards the fire, hoping that the heat will override the sensitive equipment inside his robot attacker. It works, and Spider-Man makes a break for freedom, making it look like he started the fire to any passers-by. Strom seems entirely unfussed by this development, because he's already working on a second robot that looks and behaves entirely different to the first. And, in the wreckage of the lab, we learn who Strom wants revenge on: Norman Osborn, a businessman, a friend of J. Jonah Jameson, and the father of Peter's classmate/enemy, Harry Osborn. Norman knows that this fire wasn't caused by Spider-Man. This was the work of Professor Strom, who Norman cheated out of inventions in the past. Meanwhile and elsewhere, Frederick Foswell dons his Patch disguise, eager to find out where Strom is hiding, and Spider-Man decides to tail Patch, since he can't find Foswell anyway. So they both end up in an alleyway, where Max Young, Strom's henchman, surprises Patch with a gun. They're also both in time to see the second robot, equipped with a laser face, march out into the world to get revenge on Norman. After Patch is led inside the building at gunpoint, Spider-Man quickly rescues him and leaves him inside a locked room with a gun before he goes after the second robot. That robot is attacking Norman Osborn when Spider-Man enters to save the day. The fight is pretty one-sided, as Spider-Man spends most of it dodging the robot's attacks and laserhead, but it's ended prematurely when Norman, the man that Spider-Man was saving, hits Spidey over the head and leaves him for dead. Norman was mad at Spider-Man for interrupting his plan, apparently. Luckily, Spider-Man plays dead convincingly enough that the robot doesn't finish him off, destroying the plant instead and heading back home to Professor Strom. Later, Spider-Man regains consciousness just in time to get back to Strom's base and surprise the second robot who's just arriving home, sliding low, grabbing its feet and slamming it into machinery. Max Young tries to escape. No way he's fighting Spider-Man, but he forgets that he left Foswell in the room, and Foswell has a gun. Back with Spidey and Strom, the Professor uses the head of his second robot, still firing a laser, to attack Spider-Man, but our hero webs the head away and Strom surrenders. But as Strom is about to reveal a secret, a rifle appears in the window, the rifle's owner keen to keep Strom quiet. Spider-Man is able to knock Strom out of the way, but the Professor has a heart attack and dies anyway, and the mysterious shooter is nowhere to be found when Spider-Man looks. There was no rope, no ladder, no helicopter. How did he do it? Later and elsewhere, Norman Osborn is given the good news by J. Jonah Jameson. Strom will no longer be a problem. But after Jonah leaves, we learn that Norman was the man with the rifle, and he vows to make Spider-Man pay for almost ruining everything. Amazing Spider-Man issue 38. There is a man called Joe Smith who wants to be a boxer. He gets himself a manager and gets himself in the ring, and he loses. So he decides that he wants to be a wrestler and also loses badly. So finally his manager gets him a gig as an actor in a movie, much to the derision of his boxing peers. In a monster alien costume, he's told to smash up the set in anger, and so he does, smashing debris into a light, which topples into some chemicals, and Joe Smith is caught in the electrical current. He's alive, but he feels strange. Meanwhile and elsewhere, Peter Parker is at the Daily Bugle, witnessing yet another secretary quitting. He bumps into Ned Leeds there, the man that Peter thinks Betty has run off with, and learns that Ned also doesn't know where she is either. The two men get aggressive with each other before Jonah splits them up and Peter walks off to mourn Betty's absence. Elsewhere, Joe Smith is starting his next scene, where he has to beat up some stunt performers, but that funny feeling turns into rage and super strength, and he fights out of the set and into the street. He eventually runs into Spider-Man and is able to tear Spidey's web and defeat our hero. Spider-Man didn't even learn his name. Still feeling odd, Joe Smith flees with his manager. Elsewhere again, Norman Osborn puts on a fake beard and some sunglasses and offers a handsome reward to the underworld to take care of Spider-Man. He offers half up front, literal notes that he has cut in half. Later, as Spider-Man is swinging around to clear his head, after a day of taunts from Flash Thompson and a weird encounter with some protesters, he gets attacked by some criminals who are looking to collect the reward. They don't stand a chance. And as Spidey fights, Joe Smith wakes up, feeling strange once more. He shoves his manager aside and heads to his old gym. He wants revenge on the fighters that used to mock him, and they gladly give him that fight, and the gym erupts into a brawl. Swinging past the gym, after defeating the criminals from before, Spider-Man finds that mystery man who defeated him earlier. He swings down to help put an end to this gym fight, but the boxers have also heard about the reward, and they turn on Spider-Man. So Spider-Man takes on everybody, including the superpowered Joe Smith, across a page of dramatic lettering, before Joe comes to his senses. Whatever effect the chemical had has worn off, and his manager shows up to tell him that the producers were so impressed by Joe's performance that they wanted to give him an expanded role. Meanwhile, Spidey is fighting off an alleyway of people looking to collect on a reward. He's mocked by a dummy that looks like Ned Leeds. He once again misses Mary Jane, who's leaving just as he arrives. And he has to watch on the news as this guy named Joe gets a 5-year contract in Hollywood, and Spider-Man just gets mocked. Life just isn't fair for Peter, so he goes to bed. Thanks for watching and making it all the way to the end. It has taken this project, and in particular editing these videos together, to really make me appreciate Steve Ditko as an artist. I'm hoping that by putting these videos together you can start to see the way that he laid the foundation for Spider-Man.